Hey there. Tonight we are stepping behind the velvet curtains and into quiet rooms where crowns often hid quiet, private fixations. We will meet kings, queens, emperors, and princes from many lands and ages. Each one carried an inward habit or fear that shaped how they governed and how they lived. These stories are not about glory or battles. Instead, they trace hidden patterns, obsessions with objects, rituals, substances, control, or secret fears. Meanwhile, you will see how those private habits reached beyond bedrooms and boudoirs to touch courts, families, and sometimes whole nations. Over time, a small compulsion could become a force that changed a ruler's life. If this kind of calm, slow history helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it truly soothes you. Dim the lights, settle in, and let the quiet take hold as we open the first door. 1. Cleopatra the Seventh. Cleopatra the Seventh moved through public life with an aim that became, in time, nearly single-minded. She wanted influence over the most powerful men of her age. That desire was not private in the usual sense. It was a calculated political habit. She learned to use personal relationships as instruments of statecraft, and she pursued them with attention and persistence. Her association with Julius Caesar began when she sought support to secure her throne. The alliance combined practical politics and personal closeness. Meanwhile, she found a way to present herself as both a ruler and a partner. She accepted favors and honors that strengthened her position at home. The son she had with Caesar carried his name, and in this way, she tied her dynasty to Roman promise. Those choices reflected more than affection. They reflected a steady strategy of influence. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's focus did not fade. She turned toward another leading figure of Rome, Mark Antony. Their connection had a clear political aim. He needed allies and resources, and she needed protection and recognition. Over time, their partnership deepened into a public and ceremonial relationship. She accompanied him to Rome for a period and returned with new status and respect. She staged donations of land and honors that asserted her royal authority and Antony's support for her family. She presented herself as a sovereign worthy of formal recognition. Her use of seduction and charm was deliberate and symbolic. Cleopatra understood the language of court and pageantry. She could meet rulers in private chambers and in public ceremonies. She adopted roles linked to priesthoods and to the goddess Isis. In this way, she blurred lines between religion, culture, and power. Her appearance on coins and in temples reinforced an image of divinely sanctioned rule. She did not rely solely on private meetings. She used ritual and spectacle to make the private visible, and to turn personal alliances into formal advantages for Egypt. Those practices shaped Egypt's survival strategies. The Ptolemaic kingdom was wealthy, but it was also vulnerable to Roman expansion. Cleopatra saw the Roman world as decisive for Egypt's future. She matched gifts with diplomacy. She organized grain supplies and loans. Meanwhile, she negotiated legal and marital ties that might secure Egyptian autonomy. Her insistence on controlling how Roman leaders perceived her mattered. If she could make a Roman general accept her as partner, then he might protect her borders and her dynasty. If he failed to do so, Egyptian independence would be at risk. The consequences of a ruler driven by political desire were both immediate and far-reaching. In the short term, her alliances bought time and power. They allowed her to remain on the throne and to govern with a degree of independence uncommon for client kingdoms. Her choices shaped internal policy and international posture. They influenced which cities enjoyed favor, which families were trusted, and how taxes and grain were distributed. Those are mundane outcomes, but they mattered greatly to people who lived under her rule. In the longer term, dependence on personal influence created vulnerabilities. Rival forces in Rome shifted with alarming speed. The political network she relied on began to fracture after Caesar's death. The partnership with Mark Antony became entangled with the rival claims of his fellow Roman leader, Octavian. Antony's military and political fortunes affected Cleopatra's own prospects. When conflict escalated between Roman factions, Egypt's status made it a prize rather than a partner. The naval confrontation at Actium in 31 BCE decided more than a single campaign. It determined whether Egypt would remain an independent Hellenistic kingdom or become part of Rome's growing empire. Her decisions also had a human cost. Antony's Roman allies turned against him, and Roman propaganda painted Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign influence. Romans feared that allegiance to her had corrupted their leaders. Those accusations intensified political pressure and made negotiation more difficult. In the end, the collapse of Antony's position left Cleopatra isolated. The attempt to secure her son's succession could not withstand the force of Roman conquest. When she died in 30 BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end, and Egypt entered a new era under Roman control. Cleopatra's fixation on influence carried other consequences as well. It shaped her reputation across centuries. Historians and storytellers debated whether she used charm as a weapon or whether she was a ruler using the tools available to her. Some accounts emphasize theatricality and romance. Others point to steady administrative work, to coinage, to diplomatic negotiation, and to economic management. In this way, her obsession created both a political legacy and a cultural one. Over time, images of her seduction blurred with images of her sovereignty. At the same time, her life shows how a single focus can redirect a nation's course. Her personal strategy aligned with immediate state needs, yet it also tied Egypt's fate to the instability of Roman politics. She sought permanence through personal bonds, and permanence proved elusive in that context. The alliances that protected her for a time became liabilities as rivalries hardened. Meanwhile, the mechanisms she used to convert intimacy into power left little structural independence when Rome chose to absorb Egypt. There is a quiet lesson in these shifts. Power exercised through personal influence can achieve rapid results. It can also depend on the fortunes of others. Cleopatra the Seventh moved with skill and intent. Her fixation on influence over Rome's leaders shaped decisions about war, marriage, and succession. It preserved the kingdom for a season, and then exposed it to forces beyond her control. Other rulers would press their own obsessions in different directions, and the years that followed would show how varying fixations could alter history in striking ways. To Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus became known to history as Caligula. He assumed imperial power in 37 CE after the death of the Emperor Tiberius. At first, his arrival promised a change. The city welcomed him with relief, and the early months of his rule showed gestures of generosity. He exhibited public goodwill through games and handouts. That period, however brief, gave way to a different pattern. Over time, his behavior shifted toward extreme suspicion and harshness. Many accounts from later Roman historians describe a ruler consumed by paranoia. He began to see conspiracies in ordinary disagreements. A whispered comment, a delay in an audience, or a refusal to laugh at a joke could mark a person as an enemy. Senators found themselves under sudden scrutiny. Soldiers, too, could be accused and punished without clear proof. In this way, fear spread through the palace and through the administrative offices of Rome. The court learned to preempt danger by obeying commands before they were fully issued. Caligula's obsession with divine status grew alongside his need for absolute control. He accepted titles that placed him above ordinary men and asked for honors that were normally reserved for gods. He ordered temples to be built and statues of himself to stand in places where only gods had been honored before. He demanded to be worshipped in public rituals and expected to receive the same reverence given to ancient deities. Those who hesitated risked his displeasure. He used religious ceremony to reinforce political authority, and in this way, he blurred the boundary between private devotion and state power. To make that authority visible, he staged extravagant displays. Public spectacles became a tool for persuasion as much as entertainment. On some occasions, he paraded in full regalia, draped in purple and gold, and surrounded by attendants whose role was to affirm his rank. He ordered ceremonial practices that placed him at the center of every official event. Meanwhile, building projects and costly entertainments signaled a ruler who could command resources without restraint. Ships, palaces, and festivals carried a message about his supremacy. Those material excesses declared not only wealth, but control over the city's imagination. Some stories about his extravagance are unmistakably dramatic. Ancient writers tell of a lavish temporary bridge he ordered across a bay, simply to prove that he could ride a horse across a surface that others thought impassable. They report that he planned honors for his favorite horse, providing it with a stable of marble, and even suggesting official recognition that mocked the Senate. Those tales served a purpose for chroniclers who wished to show contempt for his rule. Still, their persistence in the record suggests that his behavior contained striking elements of provocation. He seemed to test limits constantly, to see how far he could push institutions and how far he could strip away old conventions. Cruelty appears regularly in the surviving accounts. Executions, confiscations, and public humiliations increased under his watch. Property was seized from men who once held high rank. Citizens were fined or condemned on shifting pretexts. Trials could be arranged to deprive established families of wealth and status. In this way, punishments became instruments for reshaping the balance of power. People learned that possession and position offered no reliable protection. Meanwhile, the legal system bent under the weight of arbitrary judgment. Caligula's personal relationships reflected the same mixture of demand and volatility. He surrounded himself with flatterers and used favorites to enforce his will. Those who gained his trust could rise quickly, but their standing proved fragile. A slip in tone or a perceived slight could result in disgrace or worse. Sisters and close companions received honors at times, and they were excluded at others. The household of the emperor turned into a political theater, with loyalty rewarded and almost at once punished. The court itself changed as madness and power fed one another. Absolute authority meant that accusations were effective tools. Officials who feared being accused preempted potential rivals. They became adept at appeasing the emperor and at removing perceived threats. Over time, this produced a cycle in which insecurity justified more repression. The emperor's mental state, whether illness, paranoia, or temperament, met the mechanisms of control and created an environment where irrational choices had official force. People adapted their behavior to survive, and the state adapted to that behavior in return. Financial strain followed the pattern of excessive demands. Lavish building and continuous spectacles drained the treasury. To cover costs, revenues were extracted by fines, confiscations, and burdens on wealthy households. The economy felt those pressures. Long-standing families dwindled in influence as property changed hands under imperial decree. In this way, public finance and private wealth shifted in service of a ruler's needs. Resistance appeared at the edges. Some senators and officers considered ways to limit what they saw as destructive rule. Ultimately, the emperor's circle included people who judged his actions dangerous enough to act. In 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard moved against him. They struck in a confined moment during public games and private meetings. The attack ended his life and changed the direction of imperial policy for a time. The people who carried out the assassination then faced the question of how to restore order after a reign that had been unpredictable and often brutal. The aftermath revealed the cost of a sovereign who mixed unchecked power with deep personal disorder. Offices had been reshaped, fortunes transferred, and religious practices altered by demands for worship. Over years, memory of those events would be shaped by writers who sought to explain or condemn. Their accounts varied in emphasis, but they shared a sense that the emperor's obsessions had practical consequences for many lives. In courts, in families, and among ordinary citizens, the effects of fear and spectacle produced lasting changes. As one studies that period, the intersection of psychology and political structure becomes clear. Absolute authority created conditions in which private compulsions became public policy. Meanwhile, a ruler's fear of enemies made preemptive brutality seem necessary. The resulting governance relied on performance as much as law. In this way, the story of Caligula shows how the mechanisms of empire can amplify personal disorders into systems of control, and how the line between private obsession and public consequence can be thin and dangerous. 3. Catherine de' Medici. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France from Florence as a young bride. She was born in 1519 CE into a family known for banking and careful calculation. Marriage placed her inside the Valois dynasty and gave her access to power that she learned to use. Over time, she turned toward practices that promised ways to read the future. Astrology and the occult became tools she consulted often. Astrologers drew charts for births and deaths. Seers cast horoscopes for marriages and for battles. In this way, she sought a way to manage risks that felt impossible to control by politics alone. Her private chambers kept books that recorded planetary positions and details of rituals. Names come down to us in the record. Michel de Nostradame, known to history as Nostradamus, was one figure she consulted. Another was Cosimo Ruggeri, an Italian astrologer who spent years at her court. Their forecasts mattered to more than curiosity. They shaped decisions about when to seek alliances, when to move armies, and when to marry children. Meanwhile, alchemists and physicians worked nearby, offering mixtures and remedies framed in the same language of signs and balances. Those engagements were practical as well as symbolic. Astrology provided timetables. The occult offered a form of certainty that regular counsel did not. Her role shifted after Henry II's death in 1559 CE. As Queen Mother, Catherine faced repeated crises. Sons succeeded one another on the throne with short and troubled reigns. Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III were all young at points when faction and faith divided the kingdom. In this setting, anxiety about danger intensified. She watched for threats not only from foreign powers, but from rival households, from ambitious nobles, and from the rising force of Protestantism. Predicting danger became a central occupation. Foreknowledge promised a margin of safety for a dynasty that felt exposed. Court life responded to that preoccupation. Meetings with astrologers were not private amusements. They became part of political timing. Councils met after a favorable horoscope. A marriage date could change after a consultation. Invitations were issued or withheld according to signs interpreted by a trusted seer. Ambassadors learned that patience might yield a new schedule. Meanwhile, officials who believed that the Queen Mother had access to occult counsel adjusted their own plans. Intrigue thrived where certainty was scarce. In this way, belief in prophecy influenced the rhythm of governance and the choreography of favor. Her management of faction and faith shows how fear of losing power directed action. Catherine sought alliances that would protect her son's position. She used marriages to bind rivals and to placate enemies. At times, she supported reconciliations between Catholics and Protestants, while at other moments, she favored force. The choices were uneven. Her methods reflected the complexity of a state torn by confession and by noble rivalry. Guides and advisors sometimes urged compromise. Others argued for firm suppression. The Queen Mother moved among those pressures, often consulting signs that she hoped would reveal the safer path. Rumors multiplied in the gaps between public records. Stories of secret councils and midnight consultations traveled quickly through Paris and the provinces. Opponents painted her as someone who preferred plots to open negotiation. Pamphlets spread tales of poisons and hidden rites. Over time, the image of a calculating, occult-minded ruler took shape in popular imagination. Many of these accounts were exaggerated, yet their persistence affected how contemporaries and later writers perceived her. In this way, legend and political animus reinforced one another. The most lasting legend concerned the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 CE. The sudden killing of Protestants in Paris and elsewhere left a mark on Europe. Some contemporaries accused the Queen Mother of orchestrating the violence, perhaps urged by a forecast that promised danger if certain leaders lived. Other historians argue that the situation was more chaotic, rooted in long-standing tensions and immediate provocations. Still, the association with secret direction stuck in the public record. For many, the massacre became the clearest proof that occult counsel had been used to deadly ends. Accusations of poisoning also attached to her name. Stories of small doses, hidden cups, or scented handkerchiefs circulated in court gossip and in hostile dispatches. Diane de Poitiers, the powerful favorite of Henry II, was forced into retreat after his death, and property was redistributed in ways that suggested both practicality and personal grievance. Legends made these acts into a narrative of villainy. They suggested that a Queen Mother who handled secrets could also handle lethal measures. Meanwhile, documentary evidence for systematic poisoning is thin, but the tales remained persuasive to readers who preferred dramatic explanation. Over years, the image of Catherine de' Medici grew more complicated. Some saw her as a prudent guardian of a fragile dynasty. Others saw a manipulative figure who relied on occult knowledge to maintain control. Her reliance on astrology was both genuine and political. It gave her confidence, and it gave her enemies a theme to exploit. Her fear of losing power shaped alliances and accelerated rivalries. Court intrigues followed the logic of that fear. In this way, her private compulsion to anticipate danger became woven into the public business of France. Her persona continued to attract storytellers long after her death. Playwrights, pamphleteers, and foreign observers repeated the darker motifs. They amplified them for effect, while mixing fact and fiction. Those retellings helped to fix an image of a queen who was both ruler and sorcerer in the courtly imagination. Over time, that image took on its own force, separate from the archival record and from the practical steps she took to govern. Looking at her life from a calm distance, the interplay between belief and policy appears clear. Astrology and prophecy offered a method for managing uncertainty. They also created opportunities for rumor and for accusation. Changes at court reflected not only ambition, but also the ripple effects of an obsession with prediction. Decisions that might otherwise have followed ordinary calculations took on an air of ritual. In this way, the Queen Mother's private reliance on the occult shaped public consequences and left a legacy that blended strategy with story. This pattern reaches forward into other royal lives, and it opens the way to a different kind of royal fixation in the story of Henry VIII. For Henry VIII. Henry VIII became king in 1509 CE, still young and impatient for certainty. From early in his reign, one concern dominated his thoughts and actions. He wanted a male heir. This need was not only dynastic, it grew from fear, from desire, and from a sense of personal inadequacy. Over time, it shaped almost every major choice he made. At first, the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon seemed to promise stability. She had borne him a daughter, Mary I, but a son did not arrive. Henry interpreted that absence in political as well as personal terms. A male successor would secure his line and prevent civil contest. He consulted advisors, theologians, and lawyers. Meanwhile, anxiety about succession grew in corridors of power and in the royal household. Fears were practical. They concerned land, titles, religion, and the lives of nobles who founded their hopes on a settled succession. The search for a male heir moved Henry beyond private petition into public action. When he became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, he sought a legal and religious solution. That quest turned into a collision with the papacy. In this way, private desperation became state policy. The dispute over an annulment turned into a break with Rome. The king declared himself supreme head of the church in England. This change was not only symbolic, it rewrote the legal order that linked church and crown. It also opened the way for reorganization of property and power. Marriages multiplied as instruments in the attempt to secure a male child. Anne Boleyn arrived as more than a romantic partner. She embodied hope and the promise of a new line. In 1533 CE, the couple married, and for a time the court anticipated a son. Instead, a daughter, Elisabeth I, was born. Expectations changed, and so did alliances. The king's frustration intensified. Anne Boleyn's fall in 1536 CE and her execution were abrupt and public. Her death removed one hope and deepened another pattern: the fusing of personal desire with political ruthlessness. Jane Seymour followed. She offered the king a different temperament and eventually what he had most wanted. In 1537 CE, she gave birth to Edward VI, the male heir. Her death soon after childbirth added a bitter edge to the triumph. The king had secured a son but lost a wife. That combination underscored the cost of his obsession. In the years that followed, further marriages, first to Anne of Cleves, then to Catherine Howard, and finally to Catherine Parr, reflected shifting calculations. Some unions were practical. Others were attempts to fill emotional gaps. They all carried the same weight. Each marriage might change the future of the realm. The fixation on succession produced destruction in several forms. Individuals close to the king lost influence, property, or life. Political networks reassembled around the possibility of a male ruler. When factions believed they could influence the choice of heir, they acted decisively. Executions followed investigations into treason or adultery. The fall of advisors such as Thomas More and the rise of figures like Thomas Cromwell show how the court itself became a place where succession anxieties were resolved through sudden, often brutal means. Over time, the machinery of governance adapted to a more centralized and personal authority, with the monarch making demands that affected every office and household. Institutional change accompanied human cost. The dissolution of monasteries in the late 1530s CE removed a set of independent moral and economic actors from the landscape. Monastic lands were seized and distributed to lay hands. This redistribution altered the social map. Nobles and gentry acquired new estates and responsibilities. The financial state of the crown shifted as well. In this way, the king's private need for an heir created opportunities that transformed the economy and the class structure. Local churches, charitable services, and long-standing practices were disrupted. Those changes had consequences that reached beyond a single reign. Religious life also changed. Henry's assertion of supremacy over the English church meant that doctrine and discipline could be reoriented by the crown. Bishops, theologians, and parish priests navigated a new relationship to royal authority. For some, the change meant advancement. For others, it meant danger. Religious dissent and conservative reaction resurfaced at various moments, fueling rebellions and suppressions. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 CE was one dramatic response, an uprising rooted partly in resentment at reforms and partly in local grievances. The king's determination to enforce his will altered the balance between central power and local autonomy. The human consequences of succession policy were most apparent in the lives of the king's children. Mary I spent years waiting for recognition and for restoration. Elizabeth I moved through dangerous court politics that questioned her legitimacy. Edward VI inherited a kingdom shaped by his father's priorities, but he was a sickly child whose short reign could not stabilize the Tudor succession in the long term. In private and public, these children carried the scars of their father's choices. Their identities and prospects were defined repeatedly by the shifting legal status that resulted from annulments, acts of succession, and royal favor. Beyond immediate family and court, the king's obsession changed the fate of England. Royal supremacy altered international alignments. The state's relationship with the continent shifted as alliances were renegotiated in response to religious and dynastic questions. Over time, the English crown emerged as a more centralized authority with enhanced control over law, property, and religious life. That consolidation brought order in some respects and created new tensions in others. Long-term cultural shifts followed. English worship, charity, and education adapted to a reconfigured church. Landholding and local governance were reshaped by the flow of monastic wealth into private hands. Historians continue to debate motives and effects. Some emphasize Henry's personal temperament and insecurity. Others focus on structural forces that made a male heir politically urgent. In practice, the two factors reinforced one another. Personal fear pushed policy into decisive channels. Policy then produced outcomes that both solved and created further anxieties. In this way, private compulsion and public consequence remained entwined throughout the king's life. As one observes these developments from a calm distance, a clear pattern appears. The singular quest for a male successor concentrated power and produced rapid change. It turned marriage into a tool of statecraft and turned religious authority into a royal instrument. Those transformations left an imprint that extended past Henry's death in 1547 CE and reached into the reigns of Mary I, Elizabeth I, and Edward VI. Similar themes of image, succession, and centralized rule would later be central at the court of Louis XIV. Louis XIV. Louis XIV came to the throne in one form as a child, and in another as a ruler determined to embody power. He was king by birth in 1643 CE, but the shape of his authority changed most clearly after the death of Cardinal Mazarin in 1661 CE. From that moment, he set himself to govern directly and to make the monarchy visible in every corner of public life. The aim was consistent. Grandeur and self-image were not incidental tastes. They became tools and instruments of rule. The work began with buildings and extended into daily practice. Versailles started as a small hunting lodge, but over decades it became a large and deliberate project. Architects, artists, gardeners, and craftsmen were drawn to the court. Gardens were planned with exacting care. New wings rose, interiors were finished with expensive materials, and the Hall of Mirrors opened as a deliberate display. Rooms were arranged to receive guests and to stage ceremonies. In this way, architecture and decoration served a political purpose. They announced a version of the state in which the king stood at the center. Ritual followed construction. The court at Versailles moved to a steady schedule of public and private ceremonies. The daily routine of the monarch relaxed few boundaries between private life and political display. The lever, the ritual of rising, was performed in public. The coucher, the ritual of going to bed, also took place with witnesses. Nobles and courtiers watched these moments. They were not mere curiosities. Over time, they defined positions of favor and access. A place at a royal morning or evening meant more than a polite invitation. It meant proximity to power and the possibility of influence. Etiquette became a language of influence. Titles and offices were distributed with calculation. Men and women at court learned which gestures mattered, which words rewarded a petition, and which silences could signal disfavor. In this environment, the king's image was continuously repaired and reinforced. His clothes, his carriage, his bearing were part of a system that shaped how others judged him. Vanity and self-image were not private faults. They were public instruments that helped organize the lives of the elite. Versailles functioned also as an information system. The king and his ministers wished to know what was happening among the nobility and in the provinces. Courtiers acted as channels of news. Ambassadors and agents reported on foreign courts. Meanwhile, a domestic network fed the palace with rumors, grievances, and alliances. The layout of the court made it easy for observers to notice gestures and relationships. A hand on an arm, a lingering conversation near a doorway, a sudden absence from a ceremony, each detail could be read. In this way, the palace turned social life into an early form of surveillance. The state used more formal instruments as well. Petitions, letters, and formal reports passed through offices that the crown controlled. Ministers such as Jean-Baptiste Colbert reorganized administration and finances. Over time, the central government accumulated more records and more control. The king also used law and favor to manage dissent. Letters of the king and royal warrants could ruin a reputation or end a career. Meanwhile, informal means of observation persisted. Courtiers wrote letters to one another, and these letters sometimes reached the king. Servants and lower officials could report on conversations they heard. The court itself created a steady flow of information, and the crown could use that flow to shape outcomes. The rewards of Versailles were significant. Pensions, lands, offices, and ceremonial honors were given to those who pleased the monarch. In return, the crown expected loyalty and a public performance of submission. Nobles who served in visible roles found their status confirmed. Others who resisted saw their influence shrink. In this way, patronage became a mechanism for political control. Vanity played a role because the distribution of honor depended on appearance as well as on service. A richly dressed courtier might attract favor not only by competence, but also by the spectacle he presented in the king's presence. Art and culture were integral to the project. The royal academies supported painters, sculptors, and musicians who produced visible evidence of the state's taste. Theater, dance, and music were staged for the court, and royal commissions defined aesthetic standards. Over time, the court's preference shaped what was admired across France. In this way, the monarchy extended influence through cultural leadership. The king's image benefited when artists confirmed his centrality, and the nation's elites accepted a shared set of values that tied them to Versailles. The concentration of nobles in proximity to the king had practical effects on governance. By inviting the major families to court, the crown could observe their behavior and tie them to ceremonial responsibilities. Many chose to live near Versailles for long periods. Others came seasonally to be present for specific rituals. The choice to attend became a choice to enter the king's view. For some, this brought opportunity. For others, it meant confinement to a narrow social script. Luxury and ceremony carried costs. The crown spent vast sums on building, decoration, and maintenance. Taxation and economic policy had to sustain this expense. The balance between the projection of splendor and the realities of administration taxed the state in different ways. Nevertheless, the political returns were clear to Louis XIV and to his ministers. A visible, impressive monarchy discouraged some forms of oppositional behavior and encouraged a pattern of deference that eased certain kinds of governance. Vanity also shaped foreign policy and war. Diplomatic receptions, state visits, and public celebrations were stages for demonstrating strength. The king's image abroad mattered. Painted portraits and carefully arranged spectacles carried messages beyond court walls. Diplomats noted not only treaties, but the impression a monarch created through ceremony. In some moments, military success reinforced the image. In others, ceremonies attempted to repair it. In this way, external display and internal control worked together. The culture of Versailles was not uniform in its effects. Some courtiers found ways to use the system to advance local interests. Others suffered from exclusion or from the unpredictable nature of royal favor. Meanwhile, those outside the court saw the palace as a symbol of concentrated power. Peasants, merchants, and provincial officials understood that the center had the ability to command resources and to set social norms. Over time, this understanding shaped how the nation related to the crown. The pattern established at Versailles extended beyond Louis XIV's lifetime. The habit of centralizing attention and prestige around the monarch influenced later rulers and the expectations of elites. In this way, an obsession with grand display and careful self-image did more than fill halls with gold. It created structures of loyalty, observation, and reward that persisted in public life and in the institutions of the state. Meanwhile, the routines of court continued to teach successive generations how visibility and vanity could be used as instruments of governance. 6. Mary I of England. Mary I carried a single aim through much of her life. She wanted the realm returned to the Catholic Church. That aim was not a casual preference. It shaped how she thought about duty, law, and salvation. From the moment she took the throne in 1553 CE, she set about reversing the religious changes of her father and of her brother. Churches that had adopted Protestant forms were to have their old rites restored. Bishops who had accepted reform were to be removed. The Mass was to be reintroduced. In this way, she treated religious restoration as a task that required both legal authority and personal conviction. Her conviction was rooted in a long history of personal loss and public humiliation. She had been the daughter of Henry VIII and of Catherine of Aragon. When the king broke with Rome in the 1930s and declared his own supremacy, Mary's status changed. She was declared illegitimate and then later restored to the line of succession. But the experience left a lasting mark. Over time, she gathered memories of exclusion, of friends and priests who were punished, and of a court that had moved away from the faith she had learned as a child. These memories hardened into a sense of urgency. Restoring Catholicism felt to her like repairing what she saw as a fundamental wrong. Fear was a constant companion. She feared spiritual ruin for her people and political danger for herself. The political pressures were real. When Edward VI died in 1553 CE, factions moved quickly. Mary had to assert her right to rule. She faced rebellion. Wyatt's rebellion in 1554 CE drew near the gates of London and intensified the sense that her reign could be short and contested. Meanwhile, foreign threats and domestic factions complicated every decision she made. In this way, fear and a sense of impermanence fed her determination to act decisively and publicly on matters of religion. The legal structure of her program was plain and thorough. Parliament reversed key acts of the previous reign, and the ancient authority of the Pope was formally restored. Clergy were required to resume old offices. The Crown enforced these decisions through existing instruments of law. Her government reintroduced the heresy laws that had fallen into disuse. Those who spoke openly against Catholic doctrine could be tried, convicted, and executed. Mary saw this work as part of her responsibility to lead souls back to the Church. She believed that government had a role in preserving religious truth. Her measures were meant to be corrective. The human cost of those measures became visible in public trials and executions. Men and women who had embraced Protestant forms were tried for heresy. Their punishment included burning at the stake. The numbers were significant. Over the course of her reign, several hundred people were executed for religious dissent. These events were public and painful. They generated fear and hardened divisions. For many observers, they also raised questions about the relationship between faith and coercion. Mary insisted that her actions aimed at spiritual restoration. Others felt differently. This tension remained central to how her reign was experienced. Personal suffering and emotional strain defined much of Mary's later years. She married Philip II of Spain in 1554 CE, a union meant to secure an alliance and to bolster Catholic restoration. The marriage was politically controversial at home, and it did not bring the personal stability that might have been hoped for. Soon after the wedding, Mary convinced herself that she was pregnant. The court prepared for an heir. Streets were decorated, and hopes were raised. For a time, the kingdom allowed itself to imagine a future in which the Tudor line continued under a Catholic queen and a Spanish prince. In this way, a private hope became a public expectation. The hope collapsed. Mary's sense of impending motherhood proved to be a phantom pregnancy. Over weeks and months, the apparent signs of pregnancy failed to produce a child. The disappointment was profound. For Mary, the experience was not only personal grief, it was confirmation of her fear that her plans might fail and that her efforts to secure Catholic succession might be undone. She had drawn hope from the possibility of an heir. When that hope disappeared, she sank into deep distress. Over time, those moments of collapse accumulated. This pattern repeated. There were other false pregnancies and other disappointments. Each instance renewed the sense of vulnerability that had marked her youth. The physical symptoms, real as they appeared, offered fragile consolation that was withdrawn. She experienced grief, confusion, and anger. Her health suffered. Her moods darkened. Courtiers and observers recorded a queen whose emotional state could shift rapidly. In this way, private sorrow became a factor in public life. Devotion and insecurity often appeared together in Mary's decisions. Her religious zeal was sincere. She believed that she had a duty to correct what she saw as error. She acted with a seriousness that reflected both personal faith and political calculation. At the same time, she feared ineffectiveness. She feared that any leniency would allow Protestant practices to take root again. That fear informed the harshness of certain measures. Officials who enforced policy described her as resolute, while others saw in her firmness the imprint of personal anxiety. Mary's relationship with advisors and with the Spanish alliance showed a similar mixture. She welcomed support from those who promised loyalty to Rome. She allowed Philip II a prominent role, though he was often absent and never fully accepted by the English political community. She sought advice from clergy who shared her aims and from ministers who could implement them. Yet she remained watchful. She worried that the very measures meant to secure the church might provoke further resistance. In this way, insecurity shaped the contours of governance. The final years of her reign carried the weight of both devotion and weariness. The loss of Calais in 1558 CE was a political blow. The failures and the funerals took their toll. Her health declined. Over time, her body, like her confidence, weakened. Death came in 1558 CE, and with it, the abrupt end of a project she had pursued with single-mindedness. Those who followed would alter the religious settlement again. Meanwhile, her reign left a record of how belief and fear can combine in the life of a ruler. In private, Mary remained a figure whose choices were shaped by memory and by a deep sense of duty. She sought to restore what she had always been taught to value. She acted under the pressure of a lifetime of exclusion and of repeated disappointments. In this way, her severity on matters of faith was both an expression of conviction and a response to personal trauma. Her story shows how devotion, when mixed with insecurity, can direct a nation and can also leave traces that outlast an individual life. 7. Peter the Great. Peter the Great arrived at power with a single, consuming idea. Modern Europe, he decided, held the tools of strength and order. Russia would have them too. This aim shaped the shape of his rule. It was not a gentle preference. Over years and decades, he pursued westernization at great speed and at great cost. He began by sending young nobles and officials abroad and by traveling himself. The Grand Embassy to Western ports exposed him to shipyards, workshops, and military docks. He worked among shipwrights and sailors. He learned to use tools, to read plans, and to measure angles. Those skills mattered to him in personal and in political ways. Meanwhile, the lessons he took from foreign rulers and from craftsmen fed an expectation that Russian life must be remade to match European practice. Reforms came in many forms. Institutions were reorganized, the army was rebuilt on modern lines, and a navy was created from nothing. New schools and technical workshops opened. Over time, manufacturing and state-owned factories multiplied. Civil administration changed. A table of ranks was introduced to reorder status around service to the state. In this way, Peter sought not simply to add European elements, but to reorder the social logic of Russia so that service, skill, and discipline would be rewarded. The physical gestures of change were immediate and often rude. Nobles were urged to adopt European dress. Men were required to cut or shave their beards, and a beard tax placed a price on old customs. Courts adopted new ceremonies and new social rules. Peter believed that these visible changes would break inward resistance to deeper institutional shifts, yet the methods he used to enforce them could be harsh. Inspectors and police acted with force. Some beards were cut in public. Those who resisted were pressured and sometimes punished. In this way, westernization became a public and coercive affair. Personal insecurity underlay much of the urgency. Peter had grown up in a court riven by faction and danger. Regency struggles and palace intrigues had taught him that power could be fragile. He feared that Russia would be left behind, that enemies at home and abroad might take advantage of weakness. These fears made compromise unattractive. He preferred swift, decisive measures, convinced that delay would allow rivals and reactionaries to organize. Over time, this posture hardened into a willingness to use violence when he thought it necessary. Violence was not merely a political instrument. Peter displayed a specific, restless interest in the instruments and practices of force. He reorganized the army and drilled regiments with a level of detail that sometimes became obsessive. He watched executions and punishments, and he expected obedience under pain of severe consequence. The suppression of the Streltsy uprising after his return from the Grand Embassy offers one clear example. Mutineers were tortured and executed in public. Measures intended to consolidate the state left a trail of injury among those who resisted. The darker parts of Peter's curiosity extended into the medical and the anatomical. He supported the foundation of hospitals and medical schools, and he promoted the study of anatomy. At the same time, he took a personal interest in dissections and in surgical demonstrations. He attended operations and asked detailed, technical questions. Surgeons and physicians found in him a rigorous, sometimes unsettling, patron. Dentistry also attracted his attention. He inspected dental instruments and observed procedures. Medical knowledge for him was not abstract science. It was a set of skills to be learned, exhibited, and used. Those interests could blur into a taste for spectacle. Peter staged public demonstrations of scientific and medical practice. He collected specimens and instruments. He kept a close, practical engagement with the tools of modernity. Meanwhile, this practical curiosity coexisted with a taste for stern displays of discipline. He commissioned floggings and public punishments when he thought them useful warnings. Nobles and officers were not exempt from corrective measures. In this way, knowledge and force were combined in the daily practice of governance. Family life reflected the same tensions. Peter's relationship with his son Alexis became a locus of catastrophic distrust. Alexis resisted many of his father's reforms and sought refuge among traditionalist circles. The Tsar regarded that resistance as dangerous. Over time, confrontation hardened into accusation. A trial ensued. Alexis died in custody after interrogation that included violent methods. The sequence of events left a public imprint of fear, and of a ruler willing to turn even to his own family in pursuit of control. Building projects further exposed the human cost of transformation. St. Petersburg rose from swamps as a statement of new orientation toward the Baltic. Men were conscripted to the work, peasants drafted to the task. Many suffered, and many died in the winter cold and in the harsh labor. The new capital was intended to be a clear, physical sign that Russia now faced west. Yet the city's foundations were also a record of coerced labor, and of a ruler who placed the symbolic needs of statecraft above the comfort of his people. Administratively, the abolition of the Patriarchate and the establishment of a Holy Synod placed the Church under state control. In this way, religious life was folded into the apparatus of governance. The Tsar aimed for uniformity and for a subordination of spiritual authority to secular reform. Clergy were ordered to conform, and church offices were reorganized to fit the needs of the state. Public culture changed rapidly. Drinking and rough joking were discouraged in the courts that adopted European manners. The calendar and the measurement of time were adjusted. Meanwhile, lawyers, engineers, and naval officers returned with foreign knowledge. Workshops learned new trades. Over time, a new professional class emerged. But those who profited from the old order found themselves estranged and vulnerable. Peter's rule combined practical energy, curious intelligence, and a readiness to punish. At times, his reforms built durable institutions. At other times, the methods of imposition left scars. He was a ruler who treated technology, anatomy, and discipline as tools to be wielded without sentimental restraint. His impatience with delay and his fear of weakness pushed him toward coercion. In this way, the process of modernization became inseparable from the exercise of power and from a darker side of a personality determined to remake an entire society. Meanwhile, the pace of change and the stories of force continued to shape how people remembered him and how later rulers would choose to govern. 8. Empress Elisabeth of Austria. Empress Elisabeth kept her face and body under constant supervision. From early adulthood, she treated beauty as a task that required time, discipline, and detailed routine. It shaped almost every waking hour. Over time, the pursuit of thinness and the maintenance of a particular image became the axis around which much of her life turned. Her interest in appearance was not casual. She set strict rules for diet and movement. She limited what she ate and how often she ate it. Some days meant long periods with almost no food. Other days were filled with exercises designed to preserve a narrow waist and a lithe figure. Riding, gymnastics, and long walks were part of this pattern. Meanwhile, garments and understructures were chosen to hold the body in the right shape. Corsets were laced tightly and adjusted with care. The result was a silhouette that conformed to the standards she had adopted and that she expected of herself. Grooming became ritual. Hair was a central concern and received meticulous attention. Long hair required long care. Servants were trained to wash, comb, and dress it. She kept layers of brushes and oils, and she allowed only a few close attendants to see her hair unbound. The routine included measurements, frequent brushing, and careful protection during sleep. In this way, it moved beyond simple hygiene into a repeated practice that controlled large parts of her day. Skin, posture, and the smallest details of her face were treated with the same seriousness. Baths, massages, compresses, and treatments were scheduled and overseen. She sat for hours while attendants worked on hair and skin. Mirrors were arranged so that the smallest blemish could be found and corrected. Over time, this constant checking became more than preparation for public display. It acted as a continuous loop of attention and correction, a daily maintenance that left little room for casual living. The time required for these rituals shaped her relationships. Official duties were often squeezed into short windows. Private family moments were interrupted by appointments and by the need to preserve the regimen. Her husband, Franz Joseph, found his role confined by formality and distance. In this way, a partnership that began with ceremony and duty moved gradually toward a more formal coexistence. The Empress spent long periods away from court, and travel offered a way to avoid the public routines, while still protecting the practices she believed necessary. Mental strain underlay the glamour. Observers noted that the pursuit of beauty was not merely habit, but a source of anxiety. Doctors recorded episodes of fatigue, fainting, and nervous distress. She wrote about loneliness and about the pressure of expectation. Meanwhile, the court environment provided few outlets where she felt fully comfortable. The position required constant visibility, and visibility demanded the very maintenance that exhausted her. The two needs reinforced each other. Her health and mood were affected by the constant attention to surface and form. Those closest to her described patterns that resembled compulsion. She would check measurements again and again. She could become agitated when a routine was interrupted. Servants who worked for her needed patience and precision. Instructions came with exacting detail. Over time, the small actions that had once seemed manageable became obligations that structured her life and narrowed her choices. The pursuit of an ideal look also affected how she saw herself. Letters and diaries show a person who judged value partly by appearance and partly by the control she exercised over that appearance. In private, she compared herself not only to other women at court, but to an idea of perfection she rarely reached for long. That mismatch intensified the need to keep trying. Meanwhile, the public admired the result while remaining largely unaware of the work behind it. Praise and attention fed the rituals, and the rituals demanded more attention in turn. Isolation was one practical consequence. The Empress spent hours alone with attendants or alone in her rooms. Family life was interrupted by travel and by the strictures of her regiment. She avoided many public entertainments and some family gatherings. Children were sometimes left to nursemaids and governesses. In one case, she chose to concentrate affection on a younger child, a decision that left other family ties thin and strained. Over time, these choices produced distance between her and several members of her household. Relations that might have been ordinary were shaped instead by schedules, rules, and the need to maintain an image. Her mother-in-law and other court figures exerted pressure that deepened isolation. They imposed expectations about protocol and control, and the Empress responded in ways that narrowed her social world. She found refuge in travel and in private retreats, and those escapes provided temporary relief, but not lasting connection. Meanwhile, illness, grief, and the public responsibilities of the crown created further barriers. When personal tragedies occurred, she tended to withdraw rather than seek help within the family. Public admiration and private solitude coexisted in a way that was visible to those who watched closely. Crowds and court ceremonies offered attention and praise. Photographs and portraits magnified the image she had worked to create. Yet behind the same curtains, the routines continued, and a steady undercurrent of anxiety followed. Over time, that unrelenting private labor shaped the hours she kept and the decisions she made. Doctors, attendants, and close friends tried to intervene. They adjusted diets and prescribed rest. Advice came in the form of instructions and limits. She accepted some counsel and ignored other suggestions. In the end, the habits she had formed were hard to modify. The daily rituals had by then become a language through which she understood and managed her life. Her public image remained breathtaking to many. Court life, state ceremonies, and the press elevated the appearance she presented. That same image worked as both shield and trap. It permitted a certain authority of presence while simultaneously confining the person who carried it. The routines continued across years and through changing circumstances. They shaped travel plans, dictated seating at dinners, and decided who might be admitted to her rooms. In this way, the pursuit of beauty and thinness organized a large portion of her existence, while drawing a boundary between the woman at the center of the palace and the family around her. Meanwhile, the court moved on, and other stories of royal obsession awaited attention as we turned to a very different sovereign. 9. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II grew up with a mind that favored images and sounds more than public duties. From early youth, he read stories of knights and kings. He listened closely to the newest music and imagined scenes that music might show. Over time, those private imaginings became not only tastes, but necessities. He sought solitude in order to live inside those images. He sought music to make them real. Opera held a central place in his life. He discovered the work of Richard Wagner and embraced it with a devotion that went beyond simple admiration. Wagner's music suggested worlds of myth and drama, and Ludwig wanted those worlds made tangible. He supported Wagner financially and politically when many others turned away. He helped arrange appointments and safe havens. He paid for performances and for the composer's silence when controversies arose. Meanwhile, private performances were staged in the king's palaces, and music filled rooms where no one else could speak. In this way, sound became a private companion. His love of fantasy reached into other areas. Ludwig II collected stories and images from medieval and romantic sources. He adopted fashions and manners that matched the stories he preferred. Sometimes he dressed in costume. Sometimes he retreated entirely from public life and moved between rooms arranged like stages. When guests came, he often expected them to take part in his scenes, or else to remain quiet witnesses. Court life changed to accommodate the preferences of one man whose inner life lay in pictures and music more than in treaties and ceremonies. The castles he built are among the clearest evidence of how he used architecture to shape solitude. Neuschwanstein stands on a Bavarian hill as an articulated series of rooms meant to be lived in like a living image. The king imagined it as a refuge from the responsibilities he did not wish to bear. Large halls were appointed with frescoes that depicted scenes from the operas he loved. Private chambers were small, carefully detailed, and lit in specific ways. In this environment, he could place himself at the center of a narrative. The castle offered shelter, and at the same time it provided a frame in which he could be anything but a modern ruler. Linderhof presents a different approach. It is smaller and more intimate. There the king pursued refined, private pleasures. Gardens were laid out with exacting attention. Rooms were furnished with period pieces or custom-made objects designed to match a single idea of beauty. He visited Linderhof alone at times, and there he kept to schedules of reading, listening, and slow walks in planned paths. Herrenchiemsee took yet another form. Modeled after the Palace of Versailles, it was an assertion of artistic rule. He wanted to borrow the grandeur of French royal architecture while using it for his private enactments, not for public governance. Financial consequences followed. Massive spending on construction and decoration drew criticism from ministers and from the public. The court treasury strained under the cost of creating and maintaining these spaces. Ministers attempted to intervene, and sometimes they succeeded in restricting expenditures. Yet the king had means of his own, and sometimes found ways to conceal or delay payments. In this way, his desire for solitude and perfection had political effects, and those effects fed a narrative in which a monarch's private needs collided with the obligations of the state. Artistic perfection was another constant. Ludwig II pursued precise details in music, set design, and room decoration. He would not accept anything that seemed careless. When he commissioned work, he asked for studies and repeats. Painters, sculptors, and craftsmen were obliged to meet exacting standards. For operas, he wanted not only the music, but the drama's physical presence perfected. Stage settings had to convey the story's feeling. Costumes were chosen with exacting care. The king would sit through rehearsals and suggest changes. In this way, he became a patron whose demands bordered on compulsion. His fixation had personal costs. Relationships could not easily survive in such a controlled environment. Friends and courtiers found themselves alternately flattered and exhausted. Some learned to meet his expectations and to gain intimacy by participating in private performances. Others withdrew. The royal household developed routines that served his moods. Secretaries and attendants adapted to a monarch who kept regular hours for reading and music, and who otherwise avoided the routines of rule. Over time, his circle narrowed to those willing or able to accommodate his specifications. Mental and emotional strain were visible to contemporaries. Ministers worried about governance. At the same time, physicians reported signs that they interpreted as instability. A formal decision was reached in 1886 CE by a panel of officials and physicians who declared the king unable to rule. It is important to note that Ludwig II was never examined by that panel in a conventional, documented medical interview. The declaration relied on testimony and observation from a distance. That legal and medical judgment set in motion a sequence of events that would lead to the most talked about moment of his life. Authorities moved to place the king under supervision. He resisted the loss of autonomy. For a man who had structured his life around secrecy, music, and rooms built to fit his imagination, the prospect of being managed by officials was unbearable. He was escorted from his villa to Berg Castle on the shore of a quiet lake. There he was supposed to be detained for his own safety and for the sake of order. The arrangement was intended to be controlled, professional, and discreet. What happened next has been debated ever since. On a summer day in 1886, C.E. Ludwig II went out for a walk near the castle grounds accompanied by Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, a physician involved in his care. Later, the king and the doctor were found dead in shallow water of Lake Starnberg. The official reports described the scene without offering a single clear cause that satisfied everyone. Some accounts suggested suicide. Others suggested death caused by a struggle or unknown third parties. Inquiries followed, statements were taken, and the details remained murky. Over time, the silence and the many versions of events produced a mystery rather than closure. The mystery shaped Ludwig II's legacy. Some remembered him as a visionary patron of the arts who paid a high personal price for his devotion. Others saw a tragic figure undone by unrealistic demands, by the burden of public office, and by a mind that preferred stagecraft to statecraft. Meanwhile, scholars and visitors continued to debate motives, medical diagnoses, and the circumstances of his last hours. The castles he built continued to receive attention, and they still attract those who wish to see spaces conceived for private perfection. In this way, the life that retreated into music and stone remained present to later generations as both an architectural record and a human story. 10. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria carried a private and continual grief that shaped the rest of her life. When Prince Albert died in 1861 CE, she withdrew into mourning, and the pattern she set lasted for decades. The immediate shock was public and personal. Albert had been not only her husband, but her principal advisor, and the person who organized much of the household and the schedule of public duties. In the weeks after his death, she shut herself away. Black clothing became a daily uniform. Windows were curtained in black, and portraits of other monarchs and celebratory decorations were removed from view. In this way, the environment of the monarchy changed to reflect a single absence. Ritual quickly replaced spontaneity. The Queen established rules for the royal household and for official appearances that followed strict mourning etiquette. Carriages were covered in black. Court functions were reduced or suspended. Visitors had to follow rules about how and when to call on her. For a long time, the public saw only a narrow range of the Queen's life. When she did appear, she often wore the same deep mourning dress and simple widow's cap. Over time, these visible signs became a form of authority, as if the sovereign's personal loss defined the public face of the crown. The rituals had practical consequences for governance. Ministers found it more difficult to reach the Queen in ordinary ways. Papers were sometimes delayed. Ceremonial events were scaled back or altered. Meanwhile, the monarchy's social calendar contracted, and the court's rhythms slowed. Those who worked closest to the Queen adapted to a court organized to honor a memory. In this way, her private behavior influenced how state life was conducted, not only for a brief period, but for years. Children felt the pressure of this household order. Victoria and Albert's 9 children grew up within a home that valued duty and discipline, and then they entered adulthood while their mother remained in mourning. She expected them to observe the same ceremonies and to show restraint. Some daughters and sons became active carriers of protocol, traveling for dynastic marriages or serving as representatives of the crown. Others found themselves asked to comfort, advise, or simply remain close to a mother who would not relinquish certain habits. Princess Beatrice, in particular, became a constant companion. She was asked to record and to help preserve her mother's papers, and later to act as a living presence in the Queen's later years. In this way, personal devotion became a form of work. Tension followed. Children who were required to serve as extensions of their mother's grief sometimes resented the demand. Marriages were arranged for political reasons, and some children felt pushed into distant courts while still expected to return with reports and to behave with family deference. When Edward VII, the eldest son, grew into public life, he often saw himself as both the Queen's heir and the son of a woman whose grief limited her availability as a mother. The emotional labor of managing their mother's sorrow fell unevenly across the family, and it affected relationships that were already entwined with duty. Beyond the household, Victoria's mourning shaped wider cultural practices. The Queen's behavior offered a model for a society that already had elaborate rules for loss. Wearing black for long periods became more common across classes, and jewelry made from the hair of the dead found renewed prominence. Newspapers and magazines described appropriate periods of mourning and published patterns for black dress. Meanwhile, public memorials appeared in Albert's name. The Royal Albert Hall and the memorials in Kensington and in other cities were created or supported as ways to commemorate his life and to link private memory with public works. In this way, grief produced visible institutions and routines. There were contradictions in how grief interacted with empire and politics. While the Queen physically withdrew, the machinery of the state continued. Ministers and colonial officials managed affairs, and the crown's symbolic reach extended across continents. In some places, Victoria's prolonged mourning heightened respect for the throne as a moral center. Elsewhere, it fed critiques that the monarchy had become remote. The image of a grieving sovereign had moral force, yet it also raised practical questions about accessibility and responsiveness. Over time, this tension shaped debates about the role of a constitutional monarch. Grief also shaped the tone of the Victorian era in subtler ways. The period became associated with a seriousness of public life, an emphasis on family values, and a discourse about duty and sacrifice. Literature, art, and the press reflected themes of loss and domestic virtue. Funeral processions, memorial cards, and ritualized remembrance became regular features of civic culture. Meanwhile, the Queen's visible sorrow encouraged philanthropy in Albert's name, and many memorial projects combined utility with commemoration. Thus, mourning had both expressive and constructive effects. The Queen's personal methods of coping were varied and persistent. She wrote extensively in private journals, and she surrounded herself with objects that recalled Albert. She visited memorials and the place of his burial at Frogmore, and she insisted on certain rites at family events that kept his presence alive. In social terms, she discouraged frivolity at court and resisted fashions that seemed to mock the seriousness of loss. Yet she also supported public projects that carried forward Albert's interests in science, education, and the arts. Through patronage, she converted sorrow into institutional legacies. Over time, the strictness of court mourning softened, in part because new generations required different forms of representation. The monarch's long grief, however, continued to shape expectations. The public learned to associate the crown with solemnity and moral propriety, even as later sovereigns adjusted the monarchy's public relations. Members of Victoria's family carried the imprint of their childhood into their own reigns and marriages. Meanwhile, the rituals the Queen established remained reference points for how Britain and its institutions commemorated loss. In this way, a personal bereavement had collective consequences that extended across decades, altering both private households and public life in measurable ways. 11. Nero. Nero was an emperor who wanted to be seen. From the moment he took the throne, his appetite for public attention shaped many of his choices. He enjoyed the stage and the applause that came with it. Actors and poets were not merely entertainers to him. They were allies in a life that mixed performance with power. He wrote plays and sang in public. He appeared at festivals and competitions. Audiences sometimes found themselves invited to share an intimacy with a ruler in a way that other emperors avoided. In this way, admiration became a need as much as a pleasure. The rituals of performance were formal and constant. Nero arranged events that required him to play roles set by an imperial script he largely wrote himself. He took part in theatrical productions, sometimes in the company of professional actors. Chariot races and musical contests were also stages where he presented himself. Officials brought reports and petitions, while elsewhere the city prepared to watch the emperor take a bow. Over time, the boundary between private taste and public duty blurred. The palace could feel like a theater, and the state like an audience. Artistic fantasies often overrode administrative work. Decisions about building, patronage, and ceremony reflected Nero's aesthetic priorities. He invested in spectacular projects that showcased his preferences. The most visible was his new palace complex, which reshaped parts of the city and altered the physical center of power. Architects, sculptors, and craftsmen were asked to realize scenes and spaces that matched an imperial imagination. Meanwhile, resources and labor moved toward these efforts. Officials found themselves managing the consequences of lavish building programs at the same time. They tried to care for provincial unrest and financial strain. When crises arrived, the pattern of prioritizing spectacle did not always serve practical needs. Military concerns in distant provinces required steady attention. Grain supplies and legal disputes demanded steady oversight. Yet correspondence and consultations could wait while the emperor prepared for a performance or commissioned a new work of art. In this way, artistic obsession had administrative costs. Problems at the edges of the empire sometimes escalated because the center of authority appeared distracted or distant. The state's work continued, but its tempo changed to match an imperial taste for grandeur. Admiration was not merely a private emotion. It was also a tool. Nero sought public approval through ceremonies that celebrated his persona. He distributed honors and prizes to those who praised him. Poets and historians benefited when they composed flattering accounts. At the same time, those who failed to sing his praises could enter danger. Officials learned to balance candor with caution. Meanwhile, a network of flatterers and patrons formed around the imperial court, and that network shaped appointments and rewards. In this, way applause became a currency that bought favor and influence. Paranoia grew beside performance. As admiration became required, suspicion followed. The emperor feared conspiracies and imagined plots in corridors he had made familiar. Close associates found themselves under scrutiny. Ministers, generals, and even family members attracted imperial distrust. Accusations of treason appeared with increasing frequency. Trials and sentences moved from formal legal processes toward decisions influenced by personal fear. In this sense, the atmosphere at court hardened and narrowed. Purges and executions were part of this pattern. Some were the result of political calculations. Others sprang from a mind that read danger in ordinary acts. Prominent figures met abrupt ends. Poison, exile, forced suicide, and public executions removed rivals and perceived threats. The cultural elite was not exempt. Philosophers, writers, and administrators could be targeted when their views or loyalties were questioned. While a ruler's need for security is understandable, the methods used to secure it changed the shape of power and the lives of those close to the throne. The emperor's relationships with his mother and with leading courtiers show how personal anxieties translated into public actions. Family ties could become sources of conflict rather than consolation. Advisors who once guided policy found their influence ebbing when the emperor's confidence flagged. Meanwhile, new favorites rose by satisfying tastes for admiration and spectacle, often at the expense of steady governance. This rearrangement of influence had consequences for policy, military command, and administration across the provinces. Vanity informed more than ceremonial life. It affected how the emperor wanted history to remember him. Statues, coins, and monuments were tools to shape an image that matched his self-regard. Artists were commissioned to create likenesses that emphasized glory. Public narratives favored triumph and charm. Yet these instruments of reputation could not fully conceal fear. The need to be loved and admired in equal measure created contradictions. When affection slipped, authority turned to coercion. Public reaction to the emperor was mixed and changed over time. Some people admired the shows and marveled at new buildings and festivals. Others noticed the cost. Senators and local leaders measured praise against practical realities, taxes, security, and the rule of law. Rumors and criticism spread. Meanwhile, provincial governors reported instability and unrest that required attention. As suspicion hardened at court, unrest in the provinces found openings. The relationship between performance and governance thus became a source of strain rather than harmony. Histories preserved an image of a ruler consumed by vanity, yet accounts are layered with debate. Some observers emphasized cruelty and excess. Others pointed to moments of patronage and interest in the arts. Nevertheless, a pattern emerges. An emperor who prized appearances and applause, who invested in theatrical life, and who responded to perceived threats with severity. The combination of creative passion and mistrust reshaped the lives of officials, artists, and ordinary citizens alike. Over time, the accumulation of artistic projects, political purges, and diminishing trust would alter the stability of his reign. And the capital watched as events that began with applause moved toward confrontation. 12. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette arrived at the French court as a foreign princess and soon found the rhythms of Versailles both overwhelming and inescapable. The expectations were clear. She had to marry well, produce heirs, and embody the dignity of the monarchy. Protocol governed even small movements, and theater folded into daily life. She learned its rules and also learned to seek space away from them. In this way, escapism became a private response to public pressure. At first, the queen's retreats were modest. She took pleasure in small comforts, private rooms, and moments with close friends. Over time, however, these escapes grew more elaborate. Clothing, jewels, and objects offered a way to shape an inner life separate from ceremony. Fashion could be a refuge. Dressmakers and hairdressers provided distraction and control. Meanwhile, the household that surrounded her made it possible to cultivate a private style and a private circle. Those who served the queen learned to move between the formal lives expected of royalty and the quieter routines she preferred. Spending became part of this pattern. Purchases offered an emotional outlet that was immediate and visible. Rooms were redecorated, fabrics ordered, and trinkets collected. Some acquisitions were for state functions. Others clearly satisfied personal taste. Over time, the scale of expenditure drew attention. Accounts at the royal treasuries showed sums that alarmed ministers and advisors who had to balance budgets for war and administration. In this way, personal comfort and public finance intersected. Officials saw numbers on ledgers. The queen experienced relief from pressure. Escapism took a particular form in the queen's taste for pastoral fantasy. She sponsored a small village set within the palace grounds, where rustic buildings and cultivated animals created a controlled imitation of rural life. The structure followed a precise design. Cottages were arranged with gardens and a working farm. Meanwhile, staff in simple dress tended the grounds and performed tasks meant to resemble village labor. The queen visited these scenes and took part in crafts. She played the part of a landowner and a gentle neighbor. The effect was deliberately crafted and closely supervised. This pastoral project served several functions. It allowed the queen to step out of her official persona in a setting that felt less rigid. It also satisfied a desire for privacy in a familiar environment. Artisans and gardeners who managed the space worked under court regulations while maintaining the appearance of simplicity. Over time, the project expanded, and more visits and entertainments took place there. Courtiers and invited guests participated, and the illusion reached a wider audience. In this way, a private refuge slowly became a public symbol. Critics seized on such symbols and turned them into arguments. Pamphlets, caricatures, and salon talk emphasized the contrast between court life and the material hardships of many subjects. Meanwhile, political opponents and anxious officials found in the queen's tastes a target for broader discontent. Spending on luxurious items and on the manufactured village was portrayed as proof of indifference. Rumors and satire multiplied. The queen's foreign birth made her an easier object for suspicion. In this way, personal choices were reframed as political failings. Public judgment intensified when scandals appeared. One notable episode involved a complex affair over a very expensive necklace. The controversy did not revolve solely around the queen's direct actions, but it fed a larger narrative about misdirection and waste. Pamphlets and prints that described her alleged involvement reached audiences across social classes. Meanwhile, street talk, which could include exaggeration and falsehood, amplified the effect. Over time, trust between the monarchy and parts of the public frayed. Political debate moved from salons to formal assemblies. Ministers who resisted increased expenditure were pressured by fiscal realities and by public opinion. Financial shortfalls required difficult choices. Meanwhile, royal households continued to spend on court life, making budgetary reconciliation harder. The Queen's defenders sometimes argued that her expenses were customary for a court that relied on display. Critics, however, used visible examples of extravagance to argue for reform. In this way, private habit and public policy entered into conflict. Personal relations at court reflected this tension. Friends who relaxed with the Queen in private often appeared in public as defenders. Others, anxious about their own positions, distanced themselves. The Queen's circle could be compact and protective, which had the effect of increasing outsider suspicion. Letters and memoirs written after the fact recorded conflicting impressions. Some observers remembered her kindness and attention to family. Others recalled frustration with the perceived opacity of her life. Over time, layered narratives hardened into political arguments. The Queen's position must be understood within the larger context of a state facing financial strain and political debate. Economic problems, war debts, and administrative inefficiencies all contributed to a climate in which visible consumption mattered more than before. Meanwhile, political discourse evolved. Calls for transparency and restraint gained traction. The Queen's taste for escape, when exposed, became part of a debate about governance and responsibility. In this way, private refuge and national crisis intersected. Social memory shaped the Queen's reputation just as strongly as immediate political events. Satirical prints and popular songs fixed certain images. Meanwhile, court protocols and foreign origins were woven into a narrative that did not always distinguish between truth and rumor. The alleged phrase attributed to her about the poor eating bread substitutes circulated widely and hardened into moral judgment despite questions about its origin. Over time, these stories became shorthand for wider grievances, and the Queen herself became an emblem in political argument rather than a single private individual. When events moved toward confrontation, earlier patterns of escapism and expenditure were read through a new lens. What had been private choices were now civic issues. Assemblies debated finance and representation. Meanwhile, public protests gathered momentum, and the labels once used in salon gossip took on a different force. The Queen's attempts to find relief from lifelong pressure were no longer solely personal matters. They entered the public record, shaped opinion, and influenced how people understood the monarchy's role and its obligations. Over time, these elements combined with other political currents and helped alter the conditions of rule, while daily life at the palace continued with its rituals and private retreats, waiting for decisions that would arrive from many directions. 13. Philip II of Spain. Philip II governed through paper and instruction. He preferred written orders to spoken counsel. In this way, a vast empire became a forest of documents, each sheet a way to shape distant action from the palace. He read reports, received memorials, and replied with lengthy private letters. Secretaries copied his replies and sent them across oceans. Over time, this habit became a kind of rule. Control moved from presence to parchment. The empire he inherited was large and scattered. It included the Iberian kingdoms, territories in Italy, holdings in the Low Countries, and colonies across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, a new island realm in the Pacific took his name in common speech. Communications were slow. News could take months to arrive. In response, he tightened instruction. Councils were busy with petitions and regulations. The Council of State and the Council of the Indies multiplied advice and decrees, and Philip read most of what reached him. He demanded precise information and precise obedience. Micromanagement marked his style. He appointed royal officials with detailed mandates. Viceroys and governors received ordinances on taxation, trade, military provisioning, and even religious observance. He issued cedulas that enumerated procedures and penalties. At times, he instructed how to arrange a procession, how to receive foreign ministers, or how to assign quartermasters for a fleet. The intent was order. The effect was a nervous system that depended on constant signals from the center. Local initiative often withered. Over time, decision-making became slower because every unusual case might require a fresh instruction from the monarch. Religious concern shaped many decisions. Philip was deeply committed to the Catholic faith. He saw religious unity as essential to political stability. In this way, faith and rule were tightly linked. He supported the missions to the Americas, encouraged seminaries, and patronized orders that promoted reform. Meanwhile, he endorsed institutions charged with orthodoxy. The Spanish Inquisition remained an instrument he did not abandon. He read reports of heretical activity with the same thoroughness he applied to fiscal accounts. At councils, he weighed doctrinal questions as matters of statecraft. Fear of heresy and rebellion informed his international policy. Protestant movements on the continent appeared as threats to both belief and order. He pursued alliances with other Catholic rulers, backed military expeditions when he judged them necessary, and intervened in succession disputes to favor faithful claimants. His marriage to Mary I of England was one example of how marriage and diplomacy intersected. Over time, he came to view religious dissent as a political danger that required strict response. In the Low Countries, measures to suppress Protestant worship and to enforce the king's judges inflamed local grievances. He sent troops and a trusted general who followed hard lines. What began as legal enforcement became a protracted conflict. Obsession with control affected the military as well. Philip invested in fleets and in naval expeditions. He financed engagements against rival powers and against pirates who menaced trade. He supported the Holy League that met the Ottoman naval challenge at sea. Victory at a great naval battle brought relief and prestige, and yet the same system of oversight complicated later efforts. Preparations for a massive armada against a northern rival required coordination that his administrative habit sometimes slowed. Requests for money and for ships arrived as long lists. He examined them carefully. Meanwhile, seasons changed and opportunities were lost. Rigid procedure reached into the household and the built environment. Philip chose a plain court and a severe architecture that reflected his religious seriousness. A monastery and palace became a center for prayer and for government. The austerity of dress and ritual was meant to set an example. It also insulated him. He preferred solitude and a small circle of confidants. Letters remained his principal interlocutors. Over time, friends and servants came to expect long instructions. They learned that the king measured devotion by attention to detail. This manner of ruling had steady strengths. Attention to administration held an empire together for long stretches. Laws were recorded, coins were minted, and colonists received predictable orders. Yet, rigidity had costs. Local officials who needed latitude to manage crises could not always act without the crown's explicit authorization. Delays in decision-making proved dangerous in war, and in rebellion. Heavy-handed measures against dissent hardened resistance. What began as a means to prevent disorder sometimes produced it instead. His fear of change extended to finance. The crown faced repeated shortages. Silver from the Americas flowed in, then fluctuated. Philip insisted on traditional levies and privileges rather than broad fiscal reform. Credit tightened, and bankruptcy became a recurring instrument. Ministers proposed new taxes or adjustments. He answered in writing, often with conditions that limited practical effect. Over time, revenues failed to match obligations, and military ambitions outpaced economic flexibility. Paranoia and secrecy also grew where trust was weak. Spies and informants supplied reports from foreign courts and from rebellious provinces. Philip read their accounts and acted upon them. He removed officials who displeased him, sometimes for small lapses. Meanwhile, critics multiplied in exile and in pamphlets. The more he sought to control the narrative, the more rumor found a way to spread. In this way, the private habit of close supervision produced public strains. The intersections of faith, administration, and fear defined many of his major choices. He faced rebellions, religious schisms, and an evolving European order. He aimed for unity, and he believed that order required firm hands. Yet the same hands could not always adapt to changing circumstances. In the Low Countries, the escalation of repression turned urban unrest into prolonged war. At sea, grand plans encountered logistical and seasonal realities that detailed instructions could not always overcome. Meanwhile, the obligations of distant colonies kept returning to his desk in the form of petitions and inventories. His life was long and attentive. He died after many years of ruling, carrying with him the practice of governance by document. The state he left was still vast. Its structure relied on written law and on agents who acted in the king's name. Over time, successors would confront the same problems of finance, faith, and flexibility, and would measure the balance between order and adaptability in ways that reflected what Philip had made of the crown. 14. Isabella I of Castile. Isabella I believed that religious unity was the foundation of political unity. She spoke of a single faith as the common bond that held a realm together. From the start of her reign, she made clear that ecclesiastical conformity mattered as much as legal order. In this way, governance and devotion were not separate spheres for her. They overlapped, informed one another, and guided decisions that reached into homes and into distant towns. Her personal faith was intense and public. She attended Mass regularly, consulted confessors, and took counsel from clerics whose word she trusted. Meanwhile, she read theological arguments and supported reforms that promised moral discipline. Devotion was not an inward hobby. It became the measure by which she judged both policy and people. At council meetings, the spiritual dimension was often present. Advisors knew that moral concerns carried weight equal to strategic calculations. The Inquisition grew from that conviction. Isabella saw the need to guard what she called orthodoxy. She endorsed tribunals that would investigate deviations from accepted doctrine. The rationale given was clear. Unity of belief would prevent division within the realm. Those who differed would, in theory, be brought back to conformity. Over time, the tribunals took on their own momentum. Procedures for inquiry, deposition, and sentence became routine. Officials who ran these courts believed they were acting in the public interest. Their work was methodical, and it followed rules that the crown helped to define. Emotion played a role in this policy as well. Fear of heresy and of hidden dissent worried many rulers of the period, and Isabella was no exception. She had seen the damage that faction and rebellion could cause in neighboring territories. In response, she placed a high value on stability, and she trusted religious discipline to supply it. Grief and anger at past chaos shaped her caution. In private letters, she voiced anxiety about lukewarm faith and secret practices. Confessors read her conscience, and their influence reinforced a sense of urgency. Decisions that may seem harsh today were, for her, urgent means to preserve a fragile peace. Tomás de Torquemada became a central figure in this work. As confessor and as official within the tribunals, he embodied the drive for clarity of belief. He pursued cases of alleged concealment of forbidden rites and cases where converts were suspected of returning to earlier practices. The inquisitorial process involved testimony, investigation, and judgment. In many towns, the presence of inquisitors altered daily life. People adjusted how they spoke and how they met, and over time, social habits changed to accommodate a new scrutiny. Her concern with religion also shaped the building of empire. Isabella and her husband agreed that expansion should carry faith with it. Missionary activity received royal support, and voyages were framed as both commercial and spiritual projects. In this way, conquest and conversion were linked in official policy. Expedition leaders received mandates to promote Christian worship among newly encountered peoples. Clerics accompanied fleets to baptize, to teach, and to establish churches. Over time, this pattern of mission and settlement became a defining feature of royal policy. Moral conviction underpinned these choices. Isabella believed that Christian teaching offered a moral order that would civilize and improve new societies. Legal codes sent to colonial officials included expectations about religious instruction. Meanwhile, institutions such as bishoprics and monasteries were established to anchor belief in distant provinces. She saw herself as a protector of souls as much as a ruler of lands. That view guided appointments and funding decisions. Priests and missionaries therefore gained significant influence in the expansion of royal authority. Compassion existed within her practice, yet it often came second to doctrinal concern. She provided for charity and took interest in the poor. Hospitals and religious foundations received support. At the same time, compassion was constrained by a need for spiritual conformity. Acts of mercy that blurred doctrinal lines sometimes met resistance from advisors who feared laxity. Where converts were suspected of private practice of their former faith, actions taken against them could be severe. Families found themselves divided by questions of belief. The tension between care and control was constant. The policy of expulsion for certain communities emerged from these pressures. Faced with persistent doubts about sincerity of conversion, royal councils debated options that would secure what they called religious homogeneity. In the end, a decision to remove entire groups was presented as necessary for the common good. Records show debates and appeals, and they show the difficulty rulers faced when balancing order against the human cost of such measures. Those who implemented the mandates did so with a sense of duty, yet ordinary people felt the consequences in practical and personal terms. Isabella I ruled in a world where spiritual authority was a key source of legitimacy. She used that authority to shape education, law, and overseas expansion. Meanwhile, she sought to create institutions that would preserve a single public creed. Her religious zeal informed appointments at court, choices in diplomacy, and the framing of new colonies. Over time, the structures she helped to build became entrenched and hard to change. Administrators and clerics operated within systems that continued beyond her lifetime. At the center of these developments was a moral certainty that faith ordered society. It motivated the founding of schools and the funding of missions. It motivated the support for tribunals that policed belief. In private, she often returned to questions of conscience and salvation. Publicly, she insisted that rulership carried responsibilities for souls as well as for subjects. That insistence bound piety and policy closely together. The consequences were mixed and complex. Religious unity did bring cohesion in some ways, and it shaped a distinctive identity for the realm. Yet in other respects, it narrowed the scope for difference. Dissenting voices found little protection. Over time, grievances accumulated. The interplay between devout intention and institutional enforcement produced both stability and suffering. Decision-makers tended to weigh collective order more heavily than individual mercy, and the result was a regime of strict conformity. Isabella's life remained defined by this single, firm conviction. She pursued it with steady resolve, guided by advisors and by clerical counsel. In acts of governance, she combined legal measures, religious instruction, and missionary expansion into a coherent program. Those who lived under her rule adapted to its demands. In households, in church pews, and in distant ports, the effects of her policies were felt in routine ways. Meanwhile, the institutions that enforced orthodoxy continued to function, carrying forward the principle that had mattered most to her. 15. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was a ruler whose thinking was shaped as much by fear as by ambition. In youth, he saw noble rivals carve power from the throne and learned that alliances shifted with little warning. Those early experiences left him attentive to signs of disloyalty. Suspicion became a habit. Over time, it hardened into an obsession with betrayal and with ways to expose it. Loyalty tests spread through his court and his countryside. Courtiers found themselves required to take oaths and to submit to examinations that felt less like routine administration and more like moral probes. Sometimes, loyalty was measured by public display. At other times, it depended on the testimony of informers who delivered accusations in secret. These methods multiplied, and so did the sense that any gesture could be read as treachery. Meanwhile, the network of surveillance became part of daily life for many people around him. The Oprichnina grew out of that expanding system of control. Introduced in the mid-16th century, it divided the realm into two administrations. One was his personal domain, governed directly by agents chosen for their fidelity. The other remained under traditional institutions. The new domain gave him a laboratory for power. There he experimented with punitive expedients, property confiscations, and the direct removal of political opponents. The men who served him in this capacity were known for uncompromising measures. In numerous towns and estates, they enforced decrees that transferred wealth and authority to the czar's immediate circle. Paranoia guided many of those measures. Fear of plots, of invisible coalitions, and of hidden loyalties informed decisions that might look excessive to later eyes. In some cases, entire regions suffered after rumors of treason took hold. Instruments of terror were not random. They followed patterns intended to break rival power bases and to replace uncertain allies with unquestioning followers. That mechanism resembled a form of preventive governance. In practice, it produced cycles of reprisal and further suspicion. Violence became a coping mechanism for insecurity. When trust was unreliable, force felt dependable. Executions, public punishments, and expulsions served both as punishment and as messages. They made consequences visible. For many observers, the scale of punishment outstripped any rational assessment of the original offense. Over time, people adjusted their behavior to avoid attention rather than to pursue public service. Loyalty fragmented further, and the use of violence fed the very distrust it tried to eliminate. The toll of this approach reached into Ivan's private life. Family relations grew strained under the same pressures that governed his rule. A quarrel with his eldest son ended in a fatal blow that removed a potential heir in a moment of anger and regret. Contemporary accounts place that event late in his life and portray it as an act that haunted the ruler afterward. Those who remembered him afterward often spoke of a formidable mind, capable of reform and cruelty in almost equal measure. That same mind produced administrative and military innovations. He reorganized parts of government, sought to standardize law, and invested in military capability. In parallel, he pursued architectural and cultural projects, and he engaged with foreign diplomats about trade and alliance. Yet the practical achievements remained entangled with measures intended to secure absolute obedience. Over time, the combination of competence and coercion created an image of a leader whose effectiveness carried a heavy human cost. Fear twisted judgment in ways that altered outcomes for his realm. Decisions made to prevent conspiracies sometimes triggered new crises. Land seizures and mass punishments displaced productive elites and created openings for local unrest. The instruments of repression eroded informal bonds that might have sustained governance during harder years. In this way, managing insecurity through terror undermined some of the very stability it aimed to guarantee. His legacy is therefore mixed and uneasy. He left a state that was more centralized and a memory marked by extremes of creativity and cruelty. For the people who lived under his rule, daily life involved constant calculations about how to appear loyal and how to avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, historians and observers have debated how much of his behavior came from political strategy and how much from enduring psychological distress. The picture is not simple, and it resists tidy explanation. 16. Charles VI of France. Charles VI came to the throne as a boy after the death of his father in 1380 CE. His early years were shaped by a regency of powerful uncles who managed the affairs of state while the king grew into his title. Those men, among them Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, built networks of influence that would later matter in ways no one could foresee. As a young sovereign, he learned the ceremonies and the demands of rule. He also listened to voices that promised knowledge of the future. Over time, Charles developed a private preoccupation with visions and prophecy. He gave weight to astrologers and soothsayers. Courtiers reported that he read prophecies and discussed them aloud. In this way, he moved between public duty and a private world where signs and foretellers shaped his thinking. Those intimate beliefs were not merely eccentricities. They acted on decisions, on whom he trusted, and on how he interpreted events around him. The king's mental health deteriorated in stages. The first great episode of madness occurred in 1392 CE. Contemporary accounts describe sudden convulsions and violent outbursts. After that point, his illness returned in fits and seasons. Sometimes periods of clarity lasted for months, even years. At other times, his mind wandered into states that made him unable to perform the duties of kingship. Courtiers learned to live with unpredictability. Administration relied on those closest to the throne in ways that transformed government. One recurrent and striking symptom was a persistent fear, a fixed idea that his body might shatter. He spoke of being made of glass. In private, he took steps to reduce the risk he imagined. He dressed in reinforced garments. He prohibited sudden movements around him. Those measures made him feel safer for a while, and they reinforced the impression that his perception of danger had shifted from external enemies to a fragile identity. Meanwhile, the court adjusted. Rituals and access were reorganized to respect his fears and to control the risks they seemed to imply. The king's unstable condition opened space for factions. As his lucidity ebbed, rival nobles pressed their advantage. His brother, Louis of Orleans, and the Burgundian faction, led by John the Fearless, maneuvered for influence. Power no longer flowed solely through the monarch. It split among competing patrons, each claiming to act for the good of the realm. Over time, those rivalries hardened into violent conflict. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407 CE escalated the struggle into civil war. In that climate, the language of prophecy took on political utility. Claims about destiny, legitimacy, and divine favor served as tools for persuasion and as justifications for action. Charles's fear of death and of a kingdom broken apart shaped how others treated the succession and the future of France. His illness made him vulnerable to pressure from those who promised stability or who presented practical solutions to the crises of the day. His wife, Isabella of Bavaria, found herself at the center of complicated coalitions. Sometimes she defended the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. At other moments, she negotiated with the Duke of Burgundy and with foreign rulers in ways that reflected the pressing need to govern when the king could not. The longer the paralysis of authority continued, the more fragile national unity became. Regional loyalties grew stronger as central commands faltered. Local magnates settled disputes by their own force. In this way, the fabric of royal administration frayed. Social and economic pressures increased. Meanwhile, the external enemy watched. England, long a rival across the Channel, exploited opportunities that civil discord provided. Military setbacks fed political dissent. Over time, the combination of divided governance and external pressure altered the map of allegiance across France. One of the most consequential episodes arose from those pressures: the signing of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 CE. Under its terms, Charles was persuaded to recognize Henry V of England as his heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin, who would later be known as Charles the Seventh. The treaty came after military defeats and under conditions in which the king's capacity to resist was limited. It represented a formal rupture in the line of succession and in the idea of an indivisible French monarchy. For many contemporaries, it felt like the kingdom itself had been split on paper. Illness played a clear role in bringing the kingdom to that point. When a sovereign cannot be consistently present, decisions move from a single crown to competing hands. Advisors and relatives, each convinced of their own necessity, acted with urgency. Some sought to restore order through compromise. Others pursued narrow advantage. Those choices had lasting consequence. In towns and in the countryside, people lived under shifting commands and competing authorities. Taxes, justice, and military obligations were enforced unevenly. In this way, ordinary life was reshaped by the king's private condition. Charles's final years were exhausted by the collapse of control and by the long work of managing a realm in fragments. He died in 1422 CE at a time when France was divided among loyalties to different masters, and when English influence had reached a new height. For many survivors, the sequence of events linked the sovereign's private suffering with the public unraveling they had experienced. Over the long run, the drama of those decades fed later efforts to restore unity. But the immediate effects were confusion, suffering, and a displacement of royal authority on which generations had to work. The record of his life offers a study in how a monarch's mind can affect the institutions around him. When the king's judgment falters, the question of who speaks for the realm becomes a matter of power rather than of law. Meanwhile, those who held sway during his illnesses shaped policy, negotiated treaties, and arranged marriages with consequences that outlived them. The ambivalence of motive in those actions, some seeking preservation, others advantage, made the outcomes unpredictable and often destructive. Historians have debated the degree to which personal delusion and political calculation interacted in those years. Some stress the human tragedy, a king whose private fears grew into public catastrophe. Others emphasize structural forces, rival nobles, fiscal strain, a long war with England, and regional autonomy that would have tested any ruler. Both perspectives matter. In personal terms, Charles carried a set of obsessions that altered his behavior. In political terms, those obsessions met a brittle system and produced rupture. The combination is where the story of that generation of the French crown must be read. 17. George III. George III grew into his crown during a period of expanding empire and intensifying debate about the nature of power. He became king in 1760 CE, a young man expected to embody continuity and stability. For many years, he performed those expectations with discipline and a strong sense of duty. Over time, however, his life took a private direction that became increasingly difficult for those around him to contain. His struggle with mental instability unfolded slowly and in stages. Contemporary observers and medical witnesses recorded episodes that interrupted the steady rhythm of court life. Some periods were marked by clear judgment and routine attendance to business. Other stretches moved into disordered speech, confusion, and sudden agitation. These shifts could be brief. They could also extend until others felt obliged to adjust the machinery of government. At first, the king and his doctors sought explanations in physical causes, in temporary upset, or in common illness. Later, as episodes recurred, the search for cause widened. Historians have proposed different medical diagnoses. In the moment, those who lived with him focused on care and containment. During his clearer hours, George III could be exacting and conservative. He valued ceremony and expected others to follow it. Meanwhile, when confusion seized him, new obsessions emerged. Courtiers recorded repetitive actions and fixed preoccupations that appeared only during those episodes. Sometimes he returned to the same phrases, as if rehearsing a script that gave him temporary security. At other times, he inspected his surroundings with unusual intensity, asking again and again about the identity of servants, or the reason for minor changes. On certain occasions, his attention narrowed into a fear that he had been deceived by those he trusted. That suspicion could become stubborn. It produced a pattern in which he demanded repeated assurances, watched for signs of treachery, and refused to accept routine explanations. Those behaviors had a daily effect. Household routines were altered to reduce triggers. Meetings moved to other rooms. Access to the sovereign was limited to a smaller circle. In this way, the private needs of the monarch reshaped public arrangements. Ministers learned to negotiate not only policy, but also the king's fluctuating temper. Decisions that once required royal command were often handled by advisors who judged the king's condition too fragile for the strain of debate. Over time, a delicate choreography developed. People around the king adapted their speech, their timing, and even the order of events to match his capacity in any given week. The emotional pressure of losing the American colonies left a particular mark on him. The conflict across the Atlantic, from the first colonial protests to the final recognition of independence in 1783 CE, narrowed into a sequence of disappointments and political failures that weighed on the monarchy. For George III, the loss was not only strategic, it was personal. He had expected loyalty from subjects who had grown under British rule. When that loyalty fractured, the experience registered as a wound to his sense of order. The diplomatic setbacks and military defeats concentrated public debate around the responsibilities of crown and government. In private correspondence and in moments of frustration, the king returned to the theme of betrayal. The language he used was measured at times and bitter at others. Those close to him sensed grief that mixed with a rising anxiety about control. In the years that followed, the stress of imperial loss and the recurrence of illness intertwined. Public setbacks increased the pressure placed on the monarch to embody stability. When he could not reliably perform that role, others stepped forward. Ministers bore the immediate burden of policy. Parliament asserted its authority by necessity as much as by design. The relationship between Crown and Parliament shifted in practice. Not every change was intentional or formalized. Some were adaptive measures taken to preserve government during periods of royal incapacity. In this way, the institution of monarchy began to function with a different balance between symbolic leadership and political administration. A decisive turning point came as episodes of incapacity lengthened and became harder to treat. In 1788 CE, a prolonged bout of confusion prompted a constitutional crisis. Lawmakers and physicians debated how to proceed when the sovereign could not discharge his duties. The crisis subsided temporarily, but the questions it raised about who should act in the king's name remained. Later, when his condition declined further and became effectively permanent in the first decades of the 19th century, formal steps followed. The regency, put into place in 1811 CE, transferred royal functions to the prince who ruled as regent, known later as George IV. That arrangement carried practical consequences. Duties that had been concentrated in the person of the monarch were now carried out by a proxy whose political style differed from his father's. The move also normalized a new political rhythm. Ministers regularly addressed Parliament and public opinion with the regent's authority rather than with the king's direct involvement. The public perception of the crown changed alongside these legal shifts. Sympathy for the king's condition coexisted with sharper debates about responsibility and representation. Some voices framed the illness as a personal tragedy that required deference. Others argued that governance should adapt to modern needs, reducing reliance on singular royal judgment. Over time, institutions adjusted. The machinery of government became less dependent on the presence of a fully capable sovereign. Cabinet government expanded its practical remit. Meanwhile, the monarchy retained an important symbolic role, a reservoir of legitimacy that mattered even when the person wearing the crown could not steer affairs directly. Within the royal household, the human cost was plain. Family members bore the strain of care. Children learned to live in a house where moods changed without clear warning. Servants and physicians carried responsibilities that blurred the boundary between public service and intimate duty. In private moments, the king could show affection and amusement. In others, he was distant and difficult to reach. Those fluctuations defined relationships in ways that did not vanish with policy changes. The long arc of his reign carried both continuity and alteration. George III's illnesses and obsessions left marks on court rituals and on constitutional practice. They shaped how the crown was experienced by contemporaries and how it was managed by those who stood between the sovereign and the state. As new hands took visible charge, and as Europe moved into a different political century, the memory of a troubled but steadfast king lingered in conversations about the proper limits of power. Meanwhile, across the continent, another ruler, Catherine the Great, pursued her own course of reform, patronage, and private preoccupations that would place her in a different chapter of royal life. 18. Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great arrived at power with a clear appetite for ideas. She read in several languages. She collected books and letters. Over time, this appetite became an obsession with knowledge itself. She maintained a steady correspondence with leading thinkers of her day. Names like Voltaire and Diderot appear frequently in those letters. She invited philosophers to exchange views, and she sent emissaries to study schools, courts, and legal codes in Western Europe. In private, she annotated texts and ordered translations. In public, she founded institutions that reflected her conviction that learning could strengthen the state. The Smolny Institute for Noble Girls, new schools for boys, and scientific societies all grew under her patronage. Her intellectual projects were practical as well as philosophical. In 1767 CE, she summoned a legislative commission and produced an instruction known as the Nakaz that drew explicitly on Enlightenment principles. The document criticized torture, called for clearer laws, and argued for rational procedures. Meanwhile, she pursued reforms in administration, policing, and the promotion of merit in some offices. In this way, her interest in knowledge shaped projects intended to remake aspects of governance. She wanted law and policy to reflect reason as she understood it. A contradiction threaded through these efforts. While she embraced many Enlightenment ideas, she also exercised tight, personal control over her realm. The language of freedom and equality did not translate into changes for the majority of her subjects. Serfdom deepened in practice in many regions. After the violent Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775 CE, she responded with force, sending troops to restore order, and then rewarding nobles who helped suppress the unrest. The logic of security and stability took precedence. In moments of crisis, the apparatus of power moved quickly to protect the central state and its elite. The result was a ruler who supported reform in theory, but who also tightened bonds of dependency in practice. This contradiction shaped her public image. In the salons of Europe, she was praised as an enlightened despot, a ruler who used reformist rhetoric to justify stronger administration. Among her own subjects, she was a more complex presence. She financed cultural projects and supported artists, while also consolidating land and privilege in ways that favored the aristocracy. Over time, the balance between philosophy and control became a defining tension of her reign. She spoke of reason. She acted to preserve order. Personal relationships fed into this pattern. Catherine maintained a long line of favorites, men who were at once companions, advisors, and instruments of policy. Some rose for a few years and then faded. Others remained influential for decades. Grigory Orlov and his brothers helped secure her position at the start. Later, Grigory Potemkin became a dominant figure, directing military and diplomatic projects while also shaping the image of the court. These favorites controlled patronage, directed regiments, and managed estates. In some cases, a lover's influence extended into foreign policy and military strategy. In other cases, the bond was more domestic, shaping how the court moved, spoke, and displayed itself. Favorites served practical functions. They organized networks of support. They negotiated with governors and generals. They coordinated construction and managed finances. At the same time, they satisfied a personal need. The pattern of attachment became almost ritualized. New companions arrived and old ones left. In each case, the relationship carried multiple meanings: emotional, political, and administrative. Over time, the succession of favorites became a steady element of court life, one that disciplined how policy decisions were made and how power was distributed. Ambition connected all these threads. Catherine sought recognition, stability, and a legacy that matched her ideas. Her campaigns on the frontier, including the absorption of Crimea in 1783 CE, extended Russia's reach. She presided over the first partition of Poland in 1772 CE, an act that rearranged borders and satisfied geopolitical aims. At home, she favored the arts and sciences, creating collections that would later be public museums. The Hermitage began as a private accumulation of paintings and curiosities, and it grew into a symbol of cultural ambition. Her letters and decrees reveal a steady attention to biography and memory. She wanted to be remembered as a reformer and a builder. Ambition sometimes became compulsion. The desire to perfect institutions, to be acknowledged by European intellectuals, and to secure Russia's place on the map led to relentless activity. She set tasks for herself and for others. She revised laws in careful language, then returned to them for further adjustments. She organized expeditions and established colonies. She asked subordinates to prepare reports and to propose projects. In private, she kept lists, read dispatches late into the night, and expected detailed answers. The drive for order and recognition hardened into a pattern of constant work. That pattern had costs. Policies intended to modernize could also exclude or harm those left outside the circle of privilege. Measures taken to strengthen the state sometimes increased its capacity for repression. Personal attachments could concentrate wealth and influence in narrow hands. The court's cultural brilliance coexisted with social tensions in the countryside. In moments of danger, the instruments of power moved quickly and without much consultation beyond a narrow elite. In this way, the ruler's private compulsion for success and control shaped the lives of millions. Yet the same compulsion also produced lasting institutions. Schools, libraries, museums, and administrative reforms survived beyond any single favorite or advisor. Her promotion of education for some classes expanded bureaucratic capacity. Meanwhile, diplomatic achievements and territorial expansions altered the map of Europe. Over the decades, these outcomes shaped how later rulers could act and how Russian elites defined their responsibilities. In personal terms, the life was never quiet. Attention shifted from books to campaigns, from salons to military reviews, and back again. Calls for reports and diplomatic dispatches arrived alongside invitations to theatrical performances and the presentation of new paintings. That alternation became routine. It sustained a court that was both active and restless. In this motion, the ruler's intellectual hunger and political necessity reinforced one another, creating a governance style that mixed outward confidence with inward vigilance. Far to the east, other rulers pursued different mixtures of knowledge, control, and legacy, and their choices would remake different regions in other ways. 19. Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang pursued a single goal with a private intensity that shaped much of his later life. He wanted to escape death. The title he gave himself, First Emperor, announced a new order. Over time, that order included not only laws and roads, but also a steady search for ways to survive beyond the body. The desire was practical and urgent. In his later years, he spent large sums and vast energies on remedies, rituals, and expeditions meant to outwit mortality. Alchemists became central to this work. Court physicians and wandering practitioners offered powders, pills, and potions. They promised long life or even immortality. Many of these preparations included substances now known to be toxic. Cinnabar, a red mineral containing mercury, was prized for its association with longevity in Taoist and alchemical traditions. Meanwhile, other compounds containing mercury and lead were presented as elixirs. The emperor consumed mixtures that he believed would strengthen him and slow decay. Reports written later by historians suggest that he took these substances often and in large quantities. The sources that describe these practices are not always direct. Much of what we know comes from later chroniclers and from the archaeological record. The historian Sima Qian recorded stories of the emperor sending ships in search of the legendary islands of immortals. He wrote of an expedition led by a court alchemist named Su Fu, who sailed east with craftsmen, young men, and young women to find a place beyond death. Su Fu's voyage appears in several accounts, and it was entrusted with gifts and mission orders. In this way, the court invested empire resources in a private quest. Large boats and crews crossed the sea under imperial authority, not only for trade or tribute, but for the hope of returning with a path to endless life. At home, alchemy moved from theory into hazardous practice. Court laboratories mixed mercury into pills and ointments. Some technicians recommended topical applications that would be absorbed through the skin. Others advised inhaled fumes or daily doses. The emperor allowed experimentation under supervision. Over time, these experiments produced harm as well as hope. Symptoms now associated with mercury poisoning, tremors, irritability, and weakness, appear in descriptions of his last years. Modern researchers have suggested that the emperor's irregular behavior and eventual decline may have been worsened by prolonged exposure to mercury. It is not a simple record of cause and effect. Still, the connection between the search for life and the substances used is clear in the sources. Control over space and time also featured in this quest. In seeking to master death, Qin Shi Huang sought to master the realm. Unification after 221 BCE created an imperial bureaucracy, standardized scripts, weights, and measures, and organized labor on an unprecedented scale. These reforms served many purposes. They eased communication and taxation. They bound distant regions to a single center. They also made possible the massive projects that would serve the emperor's hopes for an afterlife. Roads and canals moved people and materials. Fortifications and walls extended the borders of his authority. The empire itself became an instrument for the personal struggle against mortality. The mausoleum that Qin Shi Huang planned reflected a similar logic. The burial complex envisioned a preservation of imperial reality. It was intended to mirror the world he ruled. According to records that later chroniclers preserved, the tomb was to be populated with models of palaces, officials, and attendants. Meanwhile, the terracotta figures discovered in the field near modern Xi'an speak to the scale of preparation. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and chariots were made and arranged in ranks. They were created to accompany and protect the emperor in whatever came after. Workshops produced them in patterns, and craftsmen worked under tight direction. In this way, the state's capacity to mobilize labor and skill served a private design to secure an ordered continuation beyond death. Archaeology has added another dimension to the older narratives. Soil samples taken above the burial mounds show traces of mercury. In some places, concentrations are higher than in surrounding areas. Those findings align with the descriptions in early histories that the tomb included rivers of mercury and mechanical devices. The precise technology of the burial complex remains under study, and parts of it are still sealed. Yet the evidence supports the idea that the search for immortality shaped how the emperor ordered his final resting place. The mausoleum was not simply a tomb. It was an engineered, state-funded environment meant to last. Fear of mortality also influenced policy and the tone of governance. The emperor's legalism favored strict rules, harsh punishments, and close surveillance of officials. Over time, these methods tightened central control and reduced the influence of local elites. In part, the measures can be read as pragmatic responses to rebellion and disorder. Part, they reflect a deeper anxiety about continuity. If a ruler feared disappearance, he might prefer clear, rigid systems that could outlast any single life. Standardized forms of writing, uniform laws, and centrally appointed magistrates were all ways of making the state less dependent on individual allegiances. In this way, the architecture of rule had an existential aim. It was intended to make the emperor's authority durable, even if the man who sat on the throne could not be immortal. The human cost of this focus was considerable. Projects to build roads, fortifications, and the burial complex required vast labor and resources. Records refer to conscripted workers, convicts, and soldiers assigned to construction. Many lives were consumed in the creation of monuments meant to protect a ruler from death. Meanwhile, cultural policies suppressed competing intellectual currents that might challenge the central narrative of power. Late accounts describe book burnings and the execution or punishment of scholars who resisted. Modern historians debate the scale and intent of those acts. Still, the pattern of imposing unity and eliminating dissent fits a broader picture in which empire building became a response to personal fear. Ambition and fear intersected in other ways as well. Military campaigns extended borders and brought tribute. Diplomatic gestures reinforced the idea of the emperor as the center of a new political order. Fortifications along the northern frontier began a project that would later be called the Great Wall. Over time, the labor invested in those barriers and in roads became part of a strategy to make the realm secure and stable. Control over territory and people was not only strategic, it was also psychological. The more the emperor shaped his world, the less uncertain his hold on legacy and memory might seem. Death ultimately came, despite every precaution. Sources place the emperor's death in 210 BCE. Reports suggest that he died while on a tour, still seeking treatments and still issuing commands. The official record of his passing notes secrecy, a rushed return of the body, and measures taken to conceal the event until arrangements could be made. In the years that followed, the empire the first emperor had built proved fragile in the face of rebellion and administrative stress. The Qin dynasty lasted only a short time after his death, but the structures it created endured in altered form. The terracotta figures and the sealed chambers kept the memory of a ruler who had tried, by many means, to master the one certainty every person faces. Meanwhile, the story of his search for immortality continued in the accounts that later generations preserved. Some tales emphasize the tragic irony of a ruler who consumed poisonous elixirs in order to live longer. Others focus on the scale of the projects he ordered and the ways those projects changed the land and its people. Over time, scholars and archaeologists have added evidence and questions, complicating simple judgments. The work of excavating the burial complex proceeds with care, and each new discovery reshapes how the earlier records are read. In this way, the emperor's private obsessions remain an active subject of inquiry, and they continue to influence how we understand the origins of imperial rule in China. 20. Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg as a man whose life had been shaped by odd journeys and claims of spiritual insight. He came from a Siberian village and passed through periods of wandering, prayer, and occasional trouble with the law. Over time, he developed a reputation for a particular kind of devotion. He spoke of visions and of a close, personal relationship with the divine. He practiced a blend of prayer, exhortation, and at times, fierce confession. These practices became the center of an obsession that was both private and public. He sought not merely to be believed, but to hold influence through his perceived access to spiritual truth. His manner and voice mattered. People described his gaze as intense and steady. He moved in ways that suggested both humility and force. Women were drawn to him in private rooms and in salons. Noblemen listened in halls. Clergy and critics debated his sincerity. Meanwhile, the imperial family watched from within a court already strained by war and scandal. Alexandra Fedorovna, the Empress, encountered Rasputin in a moment of personal crisis. Her son, Alexei, suffered from a bleeding disorder. When Rasputin was present, the boy often seemed calmer, and some bleeding episodes eased. The cause of those changes remains debated. Some medical accounts point to natural fluctuation in the boy's condition. Others note the possibility that reassurance and the removal of stress could reduce bleeding. In any case, the effect on the family was decisive. The Empress came to see Rasputin as a living safeguard for her son. In this way, spiritual reputation became political leverage. Alexandra trusted Rasputin's counsel and invited him into private audiences. Nicholas II, inclined to defer to his wife on domestic matters, while commanding at the front in the war that the country then named the Great War, accepted this arrangement. Over time, Rasputin's voice reached beyond prayer. He recommended officials, sometimes praised advisors, and at other moments warned against particular appointments. His opinions had weight not merely because of personal charisma, but because of the Empress's faith. Courtiers who wished favor sought his blessing. Officials who feared scandal tried to avoid his notice. The line between spiritual advisor and political actor grew thin. The circle that gathered around him took on the qualities of a cult. Admirers called him a starets, an elder with insight. Followers reported miracles, confessions transformed into public tales, and private healing moments turned into communal legend. Music, poetry, and gossip carried stories from Petersburg, drawing rooms into the newspapers and back again. Women who trusted him spoke of confession and deliverance. Men who feared him spoke of manipulation and extortion. Meanwhile, a shadow community of domestic staff, lesser clergy, and admirers facilitated his movements. He slept in rooms provided by patrons, dined with noble families, and yet kept the habits of a wanderer. Over time, rumor hardened into an image. The more he acted in public, the more his private practices were transformed into spectacle. Alcohol and sexual behavior complicated perceptions. Tales of intoxication circulated in salons. Counts of impropriety in private encounters lengthened the list of accusations. Some critics argued that Rasputin practiced a pattern of deliberate transgression as a spiritual device, using shock to prompt confession and transformation. Others saw only hypocrisy, a man who preached abstinence and holiness while indulging himself. The truth was mixed and has been debated by historians since. What mattered at the moment was reputation. Newspapers printed lurid details. Political enemies and satirists amplified them. In a time of national crisis, such stories fed public anger. The response among the elite sharpened into a plan. A group of nobles, worried that Rasputin's presence undermined the monarchy, resolved to remove him. They argued that the Empress's reliance on him weakened trust in the throne. They feared that soldiers and subjects would turn away from a court perceived as corrupted. In December 1916 CE, a plot took shape in a dimly lit Petersburg palace. Prince Felix Yusupov and others invited Rasputin to a late-night meeting. They offered wine and cakes, and then poisoned them. When he failed to die as planned, they shot him. When he still appeared to move, they beat him and finally disposed of his body in a river. Eyewitness accounts and later memoirs vary in detail, and some aspects of the killing were exaggerated for dramatic effect. Yet the core outcome was plain. Rasputin was dead, and the images of his violent end spread fast. His death did not close the matter. Instead, it intensified the sense that the monarchy faced an internal rot. For many people, the story of Rasputin had already become shorthand for everything that seemed wrong with the court. Secret influence, sexual scandal, and faith placed above responsibility. After the murder, newspapers carried photographs and salacious narratives. Meanwhile, opponents of the regime used the episode as proof that the imperial household was out of touch and morally compromised. Soldiers at the front heard the gossip, and civilians in the cities heard it too. Trust eroded. In this way, a single man's private obsessions had consequences far beyond his own life. Historians have since tried to separate rumor from fact. Some emphasize Rasputin's genuine spiritual practices and the cultural context in which a wandering holy man could be accorded respect. Others focus on his manipulation of a fragile court and on the ways that personal belief translated into political consequence. Over time, archival records, letters, and contemporary reporting have been read and reread. The picture that emerges is not tidy. It is a mix of intense conviction, opportunism, and public reaction. The cult-like following that once shielded him ended in assassination. Yet the damage to the monarchy's image lasted. The same winter was harsh on many fronts. Russia continued to fight in the Great War, and food shortages and strikes increased pressure at home. Political structures that had once seemed stable began to wobble. Meanwhile, the vacillations of leadership and the imperial family's private entanglements diminished public confidence. The assassination of Rasputin removed a single actor, but left the question of authority unresolved. The story of his rise and fall shows how a private obsession with mysticism and influence can enter the public realm and then feed back into the fate of a state. In quieter terms, it is also a record of how faith, fear, and rumor can combine to change the course of events. 21. James VI and First. James VI and First carried a lifelong interest in witchcraft and demonology that moved from private curiosity into public policy. As a young man, he lived through episodes that hardened a conviction: storms at sea, plots against the crown, and reports of secret pacts with evil spirits. Those events made the question of invisible enemies urgent for him. He did not treat witchcraft as mere superstition. Instead, he studied it, wrote about it, and sought to shape law and practice in response. The North Berwick witch trials in the early 1590s CE were a pivotal moment. Sailors and courtiers told of violent storms that threatened his voyage and the safety of his new queen, Anne of Denmark. Accusations followed. Neighbors named neighbors. Interrogations produced confessions. James read the testimonies and took a personal interest. He sat in on examinations. He read reports brought to his council. Those events found their way into his thinking and remained there over time. In 1597 CE, he published Demonology, a short treatise that explained his views. The book read as a careful argument. It laid out reasons to believe in sorcery, in pacts with devils, and in the reality of malefic forces that acted through human hands. He used legal examples and theological reasoning. He wrote in a conversational tone, which made the text accessible. Magistrates, ministers, and magistrates in both Scotland and England read it. In this way, the king's arguments traveled beyond court and into parish and magistrates' chambers. Demonology did more than state a belief. It also prescribed methods. James described how to identify witches, how to question them, and how to treat evidence. In his view, certain signs and marks could be read by trained men. He defended the interrogation of suspects and did not reject coercive methods when they seemed necessary to reveal hidden pacts. Those prescriptions met an audience already anxious about plots and heresies. Magistrates found in the king's voice a justification for stronger action. When James acceded to the English throne in 1603 CE, his writings and opinions came with him. The transfer of crowns meant more than new titles. Ideas traveled with the monarch. In 1604, CE Parliament passed a new law on witchcraft, expanding earlier statutes and imposing harsher penalties. The climate in England shifted from sporadic prosecution to a more organized effort. Trials increased in number. Accusations clustered, often around vulnerable households and strained communities. The king's name, and his arguments lent authority to these campaigns. Political decisions also reflected his superstitions in subtler ways. James distrusted secret movements and conspiracies. He believed that evil forces could find human allies, and that small gestures might hide greater plots. After the gunpowder plot of 1605 CE, his fear of hidden enemies became public and visceral. The discovery of the plot reinforced his sense that treason could wear a mask. His response combined legal punishment with a tightening of surveillance. He demanded loyalty from officials and pressed for rigorous investigations of suspected networks. In this way, fear of the unseen shaped administrative practice. The king's obsession extended to how he understood health and misfortune at court. Illness, sudden deaths, and unexplained accidents were sometimes read as the work of malefic witchcraft. Servants and courtiers learned that misfortune might prompt questions about pacts and curses. Petitions to the throne included accusations alongside pleas for relief. Some complaints asked for legal remedy, others demanded the king's personal attention. Over time, the presence of such petitions altered the rhythm of governance. Officials had to balance ordinary administration with inquiries into alleged supernatural harms. Beyond law and administration, culture absorbed his ideas. Playwrights and pamphleteers found new material in the royal voice. The theater in London staged scenes that echoed court anxieties. Readers and listeners encountered the king's arguments in print and in speech. Clergy preached sermons that connected moral laxity with diabolical consequences. Meanwhile, the popular press and gossip mills multiplied stories of witchcraft and deviltry. Fear moved through different social layers. For ordinary people, the idea that a neighbor could be in league with a demon became a working explanation for many miseries. Not all jurisdictions followed the same course. Scottish courts were more willing to apply violent methods in the 1590s CE than many English magistrates had been in earlier decades. Yet, after 1603, CE English procedures hardened in some counties, and Scottish practices influenced English judges. Trials like the famous Pendle prosecutions in 1612 CE took place in an atmosphere shaped in part by the king's ideas. The legal system found new categories of evidence and new thresholds for conviction. Over time, historians have traced a line from royal rhetoric to local action. Paranoia threaded through the rest of the king's reign. He pursued perceived enemies with a steady hand. Favorites who displeased him could find themselves isolated or displaced. He distrusted conspiracies, both real and imagined. That disposition affected foreign policy too. Suspicion of plots often complicated negotiations and made trust difficult to establish. He wrote about royal authority and divine right in the True Law of Free Monarchies in 1598 CE and in Basilican Doron in 1599 CE. These works emphasized the sanctity of kingship and the need to protect the crown. In this context, fear of occult enemies reinforced arguments for strong, even absolute, royal control. The personal and the political remained intertwined. James liked to court learned men and to debate theology and natural philosophy. He read widely about demons and angels, about medicine and magic. He could be scholarly and exacting in his language. Yet his scholarship carried a resolute assumption that the devil acted in the world and that human agents sometimes served that purpose. Officials took that assumption as guidance. Clergy preached it, magistrates enforced it, and communities responded with suspicion, and often violence. Over time, his reputation reflected this mixture. Supporters saw a learned monarch who defended order and orthodoxy. Critics called him credulous and harsh. Plays and poems picked up his themes and amplified them. The name of the king became associated not only with a significant translation of scripture and with political thought, but also with a period when fear of witches grew more intense. His legal reforms, his published treatises, and his personal involvement created a durable framework for persecution. The lasting effects appeared in many records: trial transcripts, pamphlets, pastoral letters, and proclamations. Courts recorded examinations that followed patterns he had endorsed. Families kept testimonies that echoed royal arguments. Meanwhile, the memory of plots and storms, and of a king convinced of hidden enemies, remained present in the archives. Those documents show how a sovereign's private obsession could become public policy, and how belief in demons could be made into law and routine practice. 22. Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi kept a steady focus on one clear goal: to preserve her personal power. From the moment she rose from the ranks of a concubine to become the central figure of the Qing court, she learned to measure every choice by how it affected her influence. That measure shaped the way she ruled. It shaped the alliances she formed and the compromises she accepted. Over decades, she cultivated an inner circle whose loyalty she could trust, and she acted repeatedly to ensure that control remained in her hands. Her path to dominance was neither sudden nor accidental. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861 CE, a group of court officials and princes moved quickly. They acted in a way that removed several powerful regents from effective control. Cixi emerged as a leading figure in the resulting arrangement. She took the title Empress Dowager and shared power with the young emperor, first Tongzhai and later Guangxu. In practice, the arrangement meant that Cixi retained real authority while the emperors held symbolic status. She used that position not only to guide policy, but also to shape personnel decisions and to manage rival interests inside the Forbidden City. Managing those rival interests became a daily task. The Forbidden City was a compact world of loyalties, obligations, and rival households. In order to maintain control, she cultivated networks of supporters drawn from eunuchs, palace ladies, Manchu princes, and Han officials. She rewarded service with rank, pensions, and appointments. She punished dissent by removing office or influence. Meanwhile, she kept personal ties close. Family members who proved dependable could find sudden advancement. Those who posed a threat found themselves sidelined, exiled, or neutralized through quieter means. In this way, her politics resembled a careful balancing act. Each appointment and each dismissal altered the distribution of power. Her interventions extended beyond the palace. She exercised influence over appointments across the empire. Provincial governors, military commanders, and diplomats became pieces in a larger game of preservation. Over time, she built a reputation for decisive intervention when she judged the dynasty's survival at stake. That reputation encouraged both obedience and caution. Officials who sought promotion learned to consult the palace and to frame their actions so as not to appear as rivals. Meanwhile, reformers who pushed for sweeping changes encountered a ruler wary of alternatives that might weaken her position. Personal luxury was another persistent feature of her rule. She invested in the material trappings of sovereignty with a confidence that drew attention. The Empress Dowager maintained sumptuous apartments within the Forbidden City and commissioned elaborate furnishings, clothes, and jewels. She sponsored artistic projects and maintained a retinue of attendants. Those displays of wealth continued even as the state faced mounting fiscal stress. Revenues fell in part because of military defeats, external indemnities, and the costs of maintaining an expansive bureaucracy. In this context, the contrast between imperial opulence and national decline became more visible. Observers, both at home and abroad, noticed the contrast. Foreign diplomats recorded their impressions of palace life and the scale of imperial expenditure. Chinese officials reported shortages and asked for reforms. Meanwhile, peasants and urban workers confronted rising taxes, disrupted markets, and the social dislocations that followed rebellion and foreign incursions. The state responded unevenly. At times, Cixi approved modernization measures, including selective adoption of new military technologies and institutional reforms. At other moments, she resisted programs that threatened established interests or her own control. In this way, her approach combined pragmatic adaptation with a cautious instinct to limit change. The shadow under which she ruled was not merely a matter of palace intrigue or personal taste. Decisions taken in the Forbidden City had tangible consequences across China. During the campaign to suppress the Taiyuan and Taiping rebellions, during negotiations with foreign powers, and during the aftermath of conflicts that included the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War, her choices helped determine military priorities, diplomatic posture, and domestic policy. At times, she delegated authority to trusted generals and officials. In other moments, she intervened directly, issuing edicts and reshuffling commands. That mixture of delegation and direct oversight became a signature of her governance. A particularly revealing episode came in 1898 CE, when the Guangxu Emperor attempted to implement a set of rapid reforms. The program aimed to modernize institutions, education, and the military. It met strong resistance among conservatives and vested interests. Cixi acted quickly. She placed the emperor under effective house arrest and rolled back many of the proposed changes. Those actions showed how she weighed reform against the risk of losing control. The episode did not end the desire for change, but it did postpone broader transformations for another decade. The response to foreign pressure also exposed the limits and priorities of her rule. During the Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the century, the court first vacillated and then adopted a course that invited military intervention by foreign powers. The ensuing punitive expedition and the foreign occupation of parts of the capital accelerated internal debates about reform and sovereignty. Indemnities and military occupation imposed severe strains on state finances and popular confidence. Cixi faced the dual task of restoring domestic order while negotiating a return to some degree of international standing. She pursued cautious reform afterward, including some institutional adjustments and selective openness to foreign experts. Yet those reforms were constrained by a continuous concern to avoid any transformation that might break the central hold of the dynasty, and by extension, her own position. Her health, age, and the shifting loyalties of officials complicated those late efforts. Power that had been exercised through personal networks required constant maintenance. Over time, new figures rose and old allies faded. That process made the court a place of recurring contestation. Still, Cixi managed to shape the narrative of the dynasty's final years. Her interventions influenced the structure of the state as it moved toward constitutional experiments and ultimately toward the end of imperial rule. In this way, the shadow of her authority extended beyond her lifetime. Historians have continued to debate the balance between self-preservation and devotion to the dynasty. Some point to her efforts at reform in later years as evidence that she sought to modernize while protecting stability. Others emphasize the ways in which her priority on personal power limited the scope of possible change. Meanwhile, archives and memoirs from ministers, diplomats, and palace attendants provide varied perspectives on the methods she used. They document the careful cultivation of allies, the deliberate sidelining of opponents, the ceremonial splendor that persisted during hardship, and the opaque decisions taken behind palace gates. In this record, one sees a ruler whose fixation on retaining control shaped policy, personnel, and public life in ways that reached into the 20th century. That pattern of power, secrecy, and preservation would find echoes in other courts, far removed in time and place, where rulers faced similar choices about change and continuity. 23. John of England. John of England carried a steady drive for control into every corner of his rule. From the moment he became king in 1199 CE, he treated governance as a matter of direct authority. Officials and local magnates found that the king expected clear obedience and exact returns. His methods combined administrative rigor with a readiness to use the law, fines, and royal prerogative in ways that extracted money and submission. Money was rarely separate from power in his mind. Wars, lost territories, and the costs of maintaining a royal household all demanded revenue. John turned to familiar tools of medieval government and pushed them further. Scutage, the payment in lieu of military service, became a steady source of cash. Tallage, customs, fines, and the profitable business of wardships and marriages generated more. Sheriffs and royal justices collected unusual assessments. In this way, the crown's fiscal reach grew into everyday life. Barons found their estates repeatedly assessed, their marriages delayed unless they paid, and their heirs held for ransom until reliefs were paid in full. Those fiscal measures often carried a personal edge. When nobles displeased the king, financial penalties followed. John used the royal court and its processes to press claims. He could deprive a magnate of lands by legal action, or by declaring them forfeit and granting them to a more loyal man. Over time, this pattern created fear among the great families. Some kept quiet and paid. Others began to plot how to protect their rights and properties from what they saw as arbitrary royal will. Personal vendettas hardened into policy. Conflicts with individual lords produced wider consequences. A well-known rupture with William de Breas, a Marcher lord who had once been close to the king, became public and bitter. Accusations and reprisals followed. William fled, and his family suffered imprisonment. Chroniclers later described deaths in custody and bitter punishments that fed popular rumors. The quarrel cost the crown allies in the Welsh and Marcher regions, and it encouraged resistance rather than obedience. In this way, private enmities sometimes worked against the very order the king claimed to defend. The loss of Normandy and other continental lands in 1204 CE added pressure. England's rulers had long been Anglo-Norman magnates with cross-channel interests. When John saw those territories slip away, he intensified efforts to raise funds at home. Present-day historians debate the balance of causes, but contemporaries clearly felt the strain. Meanwhile, Philip II of France consolidated gains across the Channel and pressed claims that weakened John's position. The king responded by tightening control at home. He appointed and promoted men he trusted. Castles changed hands. The crown's administrative net grew denser. Paranoia shaped many of his later acts. Fear of plots, of treachery, and of losing the throne seemed constant. He detained nobles and held heirs as guarantees of loyalty. Castles that might shelter rivals were seized and garrisoned. Letters and envoys were intercepted. In council, he weighed threats and imagined betrayals that could arise from shifting loyalties. Those precautions sometimes protected the realm, but more often they created resentment and suspicion. Nobles who believed themselves under constant scrutiny began to consider collective action instead of solitary compliance. Church conflict added another layer. Disputes over the Archbishopric of Canterbury brought the Pope and the King into direct confrontation. John refused to accept the Pope's appointee for several years. The dispute escalated into an interdict that suspended many church services, and later into the king's excommunication in 1209 CE. Laypeople and clergy suffered the interruption of sacraments and the silence of parish rites. Over time, the strain of this rupture influenced politics. In 1213 CE, John reached an accommodation with Pope Innocent III, accepting the papal candidate and placing his kingdom under papal suzerainty. That concession did not erase earlier wounds, however. It left a record of conflict between royal prerogative and ecclesiastical authority. The barons' anger accumulated around several themes. They resented heavy scutages and unpredictable fines. They resented the king's intervention in local inheritance and marriage. They feared arbitrary justice and the spectacle of favorites rising at their expense. A network of grievances slowly formed. In this way, procedural irritations turned into political opposition. Meetings among nobles moved from private complaint to public alliance. In the spring of 1215 CE, those alliances found a common voice. Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede in 1215 CE, emerged from that pressure. The document did not fall from the sky. It was the product of months of negotiation, threats, and the mobilization of armed men. The barons demanded limits on royal fiscal power, clearer rules of inheritance, and more predictable law. John, cornered and anxious, affixed his seal. The charter promised relief from some tolls and procedural guarantees in the royal courts. It spoke to immediate grievances and to deeper anxieties about sovereignty and rights. Yet darker impulses undercut the moment. Within weeks, the king sought to annul the agreement. Appeals to the Pope, to legal technicalities, and to foreign alliances followed. John asserted that he had been coerced and that the charter violated his royal prerogative. The Pope, already hostile from earlier disputes, declared Magna Carta null and void. In this decision, the king found a short-term ally. The annulment drove the crisis into open conflict. A civil war began. Barons invited a French prince to their cause. Armies marched. Castles were besieged. Those years revealed a ruler who could act with administrative skill and also with petulant vindictiveness. He could build systems that collected revenue efficiently. He could command loyalty from certain officers and raise forces when he wished. At the same time, his readiness to punish and to distrust turned governance into confrontation. The policies that at one moment seemed to secure the crown, in fact, weakened support. By tying obedience to extraction, by turning legal processes into instruments of personal grievance, and by responding to threats with repression, he made opposition a plausible choice. Across the final years of his reign, the kingdom diverged between those who backed the king and those who pressed for guarantees. The conflict drained resources and morale. When John died in 1216 CE, he left a realm split by recent memory of coercion and by the unresolved consequences of the charter. The strong administrative frame he had built endured in parts. At the same time, the reaction against arbitrary rule had been set in motion. The immediate crisis continued without a neat resolution. As the next phase of events moved the struggle into new hands and new alliances. 24. Franz Joseph of Austria. Franz Joseph lived by order. From his first years on a throne, he had learned to make life predictable. He rose to power in 1848 CE, a year of revolutions, and the experience left a lasting impression. In response, he built routines that could be counted on. The palace day began the same way most mornings. Audiences arrived at set times. Reports were read in a fixed sequence. Ceremonies followed established scripts. In this way, the emperor turned his environment into something he could manage, moment by moment. Duty shaped his identity. He described himself as a servant of the state and of the dynasty. That belief gave structure to all decisions. When crises arrived, he looked first for the rule or the precedent that applied. He relied on ministers and on an extensive bureaucracy to translate law into action. In practice, this meant that the rhythm of government often reflected procedure rather than invention. Letters and files moved through well-defined channels. Officials learned what to expect. Over time, those expectations became a form of control. The emperor's insistence on ritual reinforced a political habit, that the machine of state should be predictable, obedient, and regular. Routine also offered emotional refuge. Franz Joseph presented a public face that was composed and measured. He showed restraint in speech and in gesture. Even in private, he practiced a degree of self-control that read as emotional reserve. When his family life fractured, he did not change habits so much as reinforce them. He spoke rarely of grief in a way that broke those routines. Losses were acknowledged and then folded into duty. His letters to close relatives contained respectful language and an economy of feeling. Readers today often notice how much is kept unsaid. The world around him provided few comforts that mixed easily with his temperament. Personal tragedies accumulated across decades. In 1867 CE, his brother Maximilian had been executed in Mexico, an event that brought shame and sorrow to the imperial house. Later, in 1889 CE, the death of Crown Prince Rudolf at Mayerling created a deeper wound. The prince was found dead with his mistress in what most contemporaries accepted as a murder-suicide. Franz Joseph reacted with formal grief. He closed certain apartments. He reduced public appearances for a time, and he intensified supervision of the succession. That response blended mourning with a practical effort to secure the dynasty. Empress Elisabeth was another source of pain. Known to history by a nickname that she did not always welcome, she lived a restless life and moved increasingly away from court. When she was assassinated in 1898 CE in Geneva, the emperor received the news while on duty. Grief again became regulated. He enforced strict mourning rituals and withdrew into a narrower circle. Those rituals gave shape to personal loss, but they also marked a pattern. When emotion threatened to disrupt order, the remedy was more rules, more ceremony, and more work. Over time, a preference for structure hardened into rigidity. Franz Joseph valued hierarchy and protocol. He distrusted rapid change and preferred controlled evolution to sudden reform. This conservatism showed itself in domestic policy. The empire contained many nationalities with competing demands. He accepted a major accommodation in 1867 CE, the creation of the dual monarchy with Hungary, a concession that itself followed military defeat and political pressure. The compromise offered a legal and ceremonial arrangement that preserved the Habsburg dynasty while acknowledging a powerful partner within the empire. It was an example of pragmatic adjustment. Yet beyond that settlement, his instinct remained to keep the apparatus of rule as it had been. That instinct had consequences. National movements in Bohemia, Galicia, and the Balkans required flexible responses and imaginative political solutions. Franz Joseph's method tended to reduce negotiation to formal concessions rather than to cultural or institutional transformation. Ministers and advisors, taking their cue from the emperor's temperament, often opted for administrative fixes or policing measures. Those choices delayed change but rarely resolved underlying tensions. The empire's diversity demanded ongoing dialogue. Instead, it received orders, regulations, and occasional repression. In foreign policy, the same pattern repeated. The emperor valued alliances and protocols, and he believed in a balance that maintained imperial prestige. Yet, he also relied on military institutions and trusted conservative partners in diplomacy. When new pressures emerged from rising powers and shifting alliances, the empire's responses were sometimes slow and cautious. The annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908 CE produced a diplomatic crisis that illustrated the limits of a rule dependent on procedure and prestige. Urban unrest and nationalist agitation in the years that followed tested institutions designed for a different time. Personal temperament shaped these outcomes. An emperor who equated stability with moral duty was unlikely to embrace the kind of flexible experimentation that might have reconfigured imperial relations. He could manage an existing order effectively. He found it harder to invent an order that accommodated mass political movements and modern national identities. As the 20th century began, the machinery of a long-standing monarchy confronted a street that no longer obeyed the same scripts. Those who served him also bore the cost of his habits. Court life continued to revolve around ceremony and fixed schedules. Ministers learned to frame initiatives within established forms. Soldiers expected precise orders and clear hierarchy. Civil servants delivered routine efficiency. In many ways, those traits preserved the state's capacities. Railways ran, records were kept, taxes were collected. At the same time, the reliance on predictable channels made rapid adaptation difficult. When crises demanded quick, wide-ranging political innovation, the same routines that kept the palace stable became obstacles. Franz Joseph's life offers a portrait of governance as personal temperament. His emphasis on order and duty made him a steady presence across years of change. It also introduced a narrowness into decision-making that limited the empire's options. Losses in his family deepened his attachment to ritual and control. In this way, private grief and public administration reinforced each other. The result was a monarchy that could endure through ceremony and law, while struggling to meet the demands of a new political age. The long reign ended in 1916 CE, as Europe convulsed in a war that exposed those strains most clearly. and those who followed him would inherit a state already shaped by habits of order and restraint, a legacy that moved forward into uncertain alignments and contested loyalties. 25. Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie carried the weight of an ancient title and the expectation of a modern state. Crowned in 1930 CE, he inherited a monarchy that traced its legitimacy to long-standing traditions and to claims of descent from the biblical line of Solomon. From the start, he understood the power of image. He cultivated a ceremonial presence that linked the past to the present. Ceremonies, uniforms, official portraits, and carefully staged visits formed a steady stream of signals. In this way, he shaped how Ethiopia appeared to its own people and to foreign audiences. International prestige became a central concern. He spoke at the League of Nations in 1936 CE after Italy invaded, and the speech turned him into a symbol of resistance abroad. Over time, he learned to use global platforms to assert sovereignty and to complain about violations of international law. That strategy worked in certain moments. It built sympathy, attracted diplomatic support, and bolstered his role in Pan-African institutions. Meanwhile, his public image grew more complex. He was both the face of Ethiopian independence and, increasingly, its public relations manager. At the same time, another story developed inside the country. His court in Addis Ababa kept many of its old forms. Nobles, military officers, and advisors moved within a closed circle. The emperor depended on that circle for counsel. He relied on formal hierarchies and on the symbolic authority of his office. In this environment, his sense of being an almost sacred figure was reinforced. He accepted titles that framed him as divinely appointed, and he allowed a culture of reverence to flourish. Some Ethiopians embraced these claims with devotion. Elsewhere, a movement began that saw him as a living messiah. Followers in Jamaica and beyond named him Ras Tafari and treated him as a divine presence. That global devotion fed back into his own sense of standing. Obsessions with dignity and stature affected choices at home. He prioritized visible projects that signaled progress and sovereignty. Roads, government buildings, and diplomatic ceremonies drew resources and attention. Constitutional reforms appeared as proofs of modern statecraft. In 1931 CE, he promulgated a constitution that centralized authority and set out the monarch's prerogatives. Later, in 1955 CE, a revised constitution reaffirmed the emperor's central role while offering new institutions. Those legal texts emphasized continuity and control. They also reflected a preference for top-down modernization rather than broad-based participation. While he cultivated a picture of a modern sovereign, distances grew between palace life and rural Ethiopia. The empire contained a vast countryside with diverse peoples and economies. Local authorities held power in many regions, and the central government sometimes lacked direct means to reach remote districts. Over time, the combination of ceremonial priorities and bureaucratic layers made practical oversight uneven. Reports moved slowly through channels that valued respect for rank and formality. As a result, problems of food supply, local conflict, and administration did not always receive prompt, coordinated responses. This pattern became conspicuous during the famine that began to appear in the early 1970s CE. Reports came in from provinces about hunger, displacement, and failed harvests. Local officials sent petitions that asked for relief. In Addis Ababa, however, the official narrative resisted the language of famine. The court preferred to speak of drought or of localized shortages. That choice reflected a reluctance to concede failure. It also reflected a belief that admitting a large-scale humanitarian disaster would damage national pride and the emperor's image. The tension between reports from the countryside and the message from the center widened steadily. The myth of infallibility did not form in a single moment. It accumulated over decades through ritual, title, and the careful shaping of public appearances. People expected the emperor to embody continuity and justice. They expected him to move between spiritual authority and political command without fault. That expectation made it difficult for subordinates to deliver unwelcome news. Officials feared that frank reports would be seen as disloyal or would dishonor the throne. In practice, this created a pattern of filtered information. Critical assessments were softened. Urgent warnings arrived late or not at all. When the crisis in the provinces deepened, the government response remained hesitant. Emergency measures were introduced unevenly. Aid that did move was often funneled through military or administrative channels that prioritized control over speed. International relief organizations offered help, but negotiations with the government were cautious and formal. Meanwhile, public denunciations of the scale of suffering surfaced in the press and among local leaders. Urban protests and demands for accountability increased the pressure on the capital. The emperor's attachment to stature and his reliance on ceremonial authority complicated decisive action. He believed strongly in the symbolic power of the monarchy and in the need to present an image of order. That belief made him inclined to preserve appearances rather than to admit systemic failure. Over time, the need to protect dignity became entangled with policy choices. Advisors who shared the same instincts urged restraint, fearing that alarm would invite foreign interference or internal panic. In this way, a concern for sovereignty and reputation shaped practical decisions in ways that could be costly. Moreover, isolation inside the palace encouraged a narrower view of the country's needs. Close aides protected the court from upsetting truths. Ceremonial duties filled much of the ruler's schedule, and state visits and speeches consumed attention. From this vantage point, it was easier to see the nation as a subject of international respect than as a set of communities in immediate distress. That difference in perspective affected priorities and the allocation of resources. As unrest grew, different actors moved to fill the political space. Students, labor groups, and elements of the armed forces voiced demands for reform. They criticized the slow response and the concentration of power in an imperial center that seemed distant from ordinary life. Calls for accountability spread through cities and towns. The institutions that had been designed to project continuity suddenly faced pressures that exposed their limits. In this environment, the emperor's commitment to image and his sense of personal dignity shaped not only symbolism, but also the practical contours of governance. And the consequence was a widening gap between the palace and parts of the population that needed urgent attention. We have spent quiet time inside private rooms of power, listening without judgment. In those stories, small compulsions and hidden fears shaped public choices and private lives. Power often made habits larger, and the consequences reached beyond the person who carried them. Over time, these patterns affected families, advisors, and entire communities. Meanwhile, the detail of each life reminds us that rulers were still people with limits and needs. In this way, the past asks for a calm attention rather than a quick verdict. Let that thought rest with you now, soft and steady. good rest.